Section 31 of Library The World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 15, by Various. Selected excerpts by Benito Perez Galdós. The first night of a famous play in the year 1807, from The Court of Charles IV, copyright 1888 by W.S. Gottsberger, reprinted by permission of George G. Peck, publisher, New York. Gabriel, a boy of 16, has taken service as page with a very charming actress of the Príncipe Theatre. Between this theatre and La Cruz exists the same sort of hostility as between the rival theatres at Venice when Goldoni inaugurated his reform. La Cruz represents the new and natural spirit in the drama, as against the absurd artificial tradition that had prevailed up to that time. A part of Gabriel's duties is to go and hiss the plays at that theatre. The principal occasion of this kind is when he accompanies a band, led by a rival playwright, to the first performance of El Sí de las Niñas, The Maiden's Yes, by the famous Moratin, the leading piece of the new school. What an opening! He, the rival poet and playwright, exclaimed as he listened to the first dialogue between Don Diego and Simon. A pretty way to begin a comedy. The scene, a village inn. What can happen of any interest in a village inn? In all my plays, and they are many, though never a one has been represented, the action opens in a Corinthian garden, with monumental fountains to the right and left, and a temple of Juno in the background, or in a wide square with 3 regiments drawn up, and in the background the city of Warsaw, with a bridge, and so forth. And just listen to the twaddle this old man is made to talk. He is about to marry a young girl who has been brought up by the nuns of Guadalajara. Well, is that very remarkable? Is not that a matter of everyday occurrence? Pouring out these remarks, that confounded poet did not allow me to hear a word of the piece, and though I answered all his comments with humbly acquiescent monosyllables, I only wished that he would hold his tongue. Deuce take him! What a vulgar subject! What low ideas! He exclaimed, loud enough for everyone to hear. And this is how comedies are written? But let us listen to it, said I, finding my chief's comments quite intolerable. We can laugh at Moratin afterwards. But I cannot bear such a medley of absurdities, he went on. We do not come to the theatre to see just what is to be seen any day in the streets, or in every house you go into. If instead of enlarging on her matrimonial experiences, the lady were to come in invoking curses on an enemy, because he had killed 1 in 20 of her sons in battle, and left her with only the 22nd, still an infant at the breast. And if she had to carry that one off to save him from being eaten by the besieged, all dying of famine, then there would be some interest in the plot, and the public would clap their hands till they were sore. Gabriel, my boy, we must protest vehemently. We must thump the floor with our feet and sticks to show that we are bored and out of patience. Yawn, open your mouth till your jaws are dislocated. Look about you. Let all the neighbors see that we are people of taste and utterly weary of this tiresome and monstrous piece. No sooner said than done. We began thumping on the floor and yawning in chorus, exclaiming, "What a bore! What a dreary piece! What waste of money!" and other phrases to the same effect, all of which soon bore fruit. The party in the pit imitated our patriotic sample with great exactness. A general murmur of dissatisfaction was presently audible from every part of the theatre, For though the author had enemies, he had no lack of friends, too, scattered throughout the pit, boxers and upper-tiers, and they were not slow to protest against our demonstration, sometimes by applauding, and then again by roaring at us with threats and oaths to be silent, till a stentorian voice from the very back of the pit bellowed, "Turn the blackguards out," raising a noisy scorn of applause that reduced us to silence. Our poetaster was almost jumping out of his skin with indignation and persisted in making his remarks as the piece went on. "A pretty plot indeed. It seems hardly credible that a civilized nation should applaud it. I would sentence Moreton to the galleys and forbid his writing such coarse stuff as long as he lives. So you call this a play, Gabrielito? There is no intrigue, no plot, no surprise, no catastrophe, no illusion, no quid pro quo, no attempt at disguising a character to make it seem another, not even the little complication that comes of two men provoking each other as enemies, and then discovering that they are father and son. If Don Diego now were to catch his nephew and kill him out of hand in the cellar, and prepare a banquet and have a dish of the victim's flesh served up to his bride, well disguised with spice and bay leaves, there would be some spirit in the thing." I could not, in fact, conceal my enjoyment of the scene, which seemed to me a masterpiece of nature, grace, and interesting comedy. The poet, however, called me to order, abusing me for deserting to the hostile camp. "I beg your pardon," said I. "It was a mistake, and yet does it not strike you, too, that this scene is not altogether bad?" "How should you be able to judge? A mere novice who never wrote a line in your life. Pray, what is there in this scene in the least remarkable or pathetic or historical?" "But it is nature itself. I feel that I have seen in the real world just what the author has set on the stage." "Gabby, simpleton, that is exactly what makes it so bad. Have you not observed that in Frederick II, in Catherine of Russia, in The Slave of Negroponte, and other fine works, nothing ever takes place that has the smallest resemblance to real life? Is not everything in those plays strange, startling, exceptional, wonderful, and surprising? That is why they are so good. The poets of today do not choose to imitate those of my time, and hence art has fallen to the lowest depths." "And yet, begging your pardon," I said, "I cannot help thinking. The play is wretched, I quite agree, and when you say so, there must be a good reason for it. But the idea here seems to me a good one, since I fancy the author has intended to censure the vicious system of education which young girls get nowadays." "And who asked the author to introduce all this philosophy?" said the pedant. "What has the theater to do with moralizing? In The Magician of Astrakhan, in Leo and the Austrias, gave heraldry to Spain, and in The Triumphs of Don Pelayo, plays that all the world admires, did you ever find a passage that describes how girls are to be brought up?" I have certainly read or heard somewhere that the theater was to serve the purposes of entertainment and instruction. Stuff and nonsense. Translation of Clara Bell. Donna Perfecta's Daughter. From Donna Perfecta, copyright 1895 by Harper and Brothers. Pepe Ray, a young engineer, arrives at Old Josa to marry his cousin Rosario, the match having been made up between his father and Donna Perfecta, the girl's mother, who is warmly attached to the father of Pepe, her brother, and furthermore under heavy obligations to him for his excellent management of her large property interests. The landscape is the arid and poverty-stricken country of central Spain, though the town itself, seated on the slope of a hill, from the midst of whose closely clustered houses arose many dark towers, and on the height above it the ruins of a dilapidated castle. Such a town would probably be more appreciated by a traveler from abroad and a lover of the picturesque than by a Spaniard, too familiar with its type. Old Bedrosa is a little place, full of narrow prejudices and vanities. Pepe Rey, with his modern ways, soon finds that he is wounding these prejudices at every turn. We look on with pained surprise at the difficulties that grew up around the young man, an excellent and kind-hearted fellow. Lawsuits are multiplied against him. He is turned out of the cathedral by order of the bishop for strolling about during service time to look at some architectural features, and he is refused the hand of his cousin. Donna Perfecta herself joins in this hostility, which finally develops into a venomous bitterness that menaces his life. Such a feeling was not the outgrowth of mere provincial narrowness. We see in the end that it was the result of the plot of Maria Remedios, a woman of a humble sort, who aspired to secure the heiress Rosario for her own chubby-faced, homebred son. She influenced the village priest, and he influenced Donna Perfecta. Early in the day, the young engineer would have abandoned the sinister place but for Rosario, who really loved him. She conveyed to him, on a scrap from the margin of a newspaper, the message: "They say you are going away. If you do, I shall die." She is a charming picture of girlhood, lovely, true-hearted, affectionate, aspiring to be heroic, and yet crippled at last by a filial conscience and the long habit of clinging dependence. She has agreed to flee at night with her lover, and he is already in the garden. Her mother, the stern Donna Perfecta, ranging uneasily through the house, enters her room about the appointed time for the escape. "Why don't you sleep?" her mother asked her. "What time is it?" asked the girl. "It will soon be midnight." Rosario was trembling, and everything about her denoted the keenest anxiety. She lifted her eyes to heaven supplicatingly, and then turned them on her mother with a look of the utmost terror. "Why, what is the matter with you?" "Did you not say it was midnight?" "Yes." "Then, but is it already midnight?" "Something is the matter with you. You have something on your mind," said her mother, fixing on her daughter her penetrating eyes. "Yes, I wanted to tell you," stammered the girl. "I wanted to say, nothing, I will go to sleep." "Rosario, Rosario, your mother can read your heart like an open book," exclaimed Donna Perfecta with severity. "You are agitated. I have already told you that I am willing to pardon you if you will repent, if you are a good and sensible girl." "Why, am I not good? Ah, mamma, I am dying." Rosario burst into a flood of bitter and disconsolate tears. "What are these tears about?" said her mother, embracing her. "If they are tears of repentance, blessed be they." "I don't repent. I can't repent," cried the girl, in a burst of sublime despair. She lifted her head, and in her face was depicted a sudden inspired strength. Her hair fell in disorder over her shoulders. Never was there seen a more beautiful image of a rebellious angel. "What is this? Have you lost your senses?" said Donna Perfecta, laying both hands on her daughter's shoulders. "I am going away, said the girl with an exhalation of delirium, and she sprang out of bed. "Rosario, my daughter, for God's sake, what is this?" "Ah, mamma, senora," exclaimed the girl, embracing her mother, "bind me fast." "In truth, you would deserve it. What madness is this?" "Bind me fast. I am going away with him." "Has he told you to do so? Has he counseled you to do that? Has he commanded you to do that?" asked the mother, launching these words like thunderbolts against her daughter. "He has counseled me to do it. We have agreed to be married. We must be married, mamma, dear mamma. I will love you. I know what I ought to love you. I shall be forever lost if I do not love you. Rosario, Rosario, cried Donna Perfecta in a terrible voice. Rise. There was a short pause. This man, has he written to you? Yes. Have you seen him again since that night? Yes. And you have written to him? I have written to him also. Oh, Senora, why do you look at me in that way? You are not my mother. Would to God that I were not. Rejoice in the harm you are doing me. You are killing me. You have given me my death blow, cried Donna Perfecta, with indescribable agitation. You say that that man is my husband. I will be his wife, protected by the law. You are not a woman. Why do you look at me in that way? You make me tremble. Mother, mother, do not condemn me. You have already condemned yourself. That is enough. Obey me, and I will forgive you. Answer me. When did you receive letters from that man? Today. What treachery! What infamy! Cried her mother, roaring rather than speaking. Had you appointed a meeting? Yes. When? Tonight. Where? Here. I will confess everything, everything. I know it is a crime. I am a wretch. But you, my mother, will you take me out of this hell? Give your consent. Say one word to me, only one word. That man here in my house, cried Donna Perfecta, springing back several paces from her daughter. Rosario followed her on her knees. At the same instant, 3 blows were heard, 3 crashes, 3 explosions. Maria Remedios had spied upon Pepe Rey, the lover, shown Capaluca, a brutal servant and ally, how to follow him stealthily into the garden, and had then come to arouse the house. It was the heart of Maria Remedios's knocking at the door through the knocker. The house trembled with an awful dread. Mother and daughter stood as motionless as statues. A servant went downstairs to open the door, and shortly afterwards Maria Remedios, who was not now a woman, but a basilisk, enveloped in a mantle, entered Donna Perfecta's room. Her face, flushed with anxiety, exhaled fire. He is there, she said as she entered. He got into the garden through the condemned door. She paused for breath at every syllable. I know already, returned Donna Perfecta with a sort of bellow. Rosario fell senseless to the floor. Let us go downstairs, said Donna Perfecta, without paying any attention to her daughter's swoon. The 2 women glided downstairs like 2 snakes. The maids and the manservant were in the hall, not knowing what to do. Donna Perfecta passed through the dining room into the garden, followed by Maria Remedios. Fortunately, we have a Accadian-Babylonian here, said the canon's niece. Where? In the garden also. He climbed over the wall. Donna Perfecta explored the darkness with her wrathful eyes. Rage gave them the singular power of seeing in the dark that is peculiar to the feline race. I see a figure there, she said. It is going towards the oleanders. It is he, cried Remedios. But here comes Ramos. Ramos, Cristobal Ramos, or Capaluca. The colossal figure of the centaur was plainly distinguishable. Towards the oleanders, Ramos, towards the oleanders. Donna Perfecta took a few steps forward. Her hoarse voice, vibrating with a terrible accent, hissed forth these words. Cristobal, Cristobal, kill him. A shot was heard, then another. Translation of Mary J. Serrano. A family of office holders. Don Francisco de Bringas de Caballero had a second-class clerkship in one of the most ancient of the royal bureaus. He belonged to a family which had held just such offices for time out of mind. Government employees were his parents and his grandparents, and it is believed that his great-grandparents and even the ancestors of these served in one way and another in the administration of the two worlds. His wife, Donna Rosalia Pipion, was equally connected with the official class, and particularly with that which had to do with the domestic service of the royal abodes. Thus, on producing her family tree, this was found to show not so much glorious deeds of war and statesmanship as those humbler doings belonging to a long and intimate association with the royal person. Her mother had been lady of the Queen's wardrobe, her uncle a halberdier of the royal guard, her grandfather keeper of the buttery, other uncles at various removes, equerries, pages, dispatch-bearers, huntsmen, and managers of the royal farm at Aranjuez, and so forth and so on. For this dame there existed two things wholly divine, namely, heaven and that almost equally desirable dwelling place for the elect, which we indicate by the mere laconic word, the palace. In the palace were her family history and her ideal. Her aspiration was that Bringas might obtain a superior post in the royal exchequer, and that then they should go and take up their abode in one of the apartments of the second story of the great mansion, which were conceded to such tenants. The above is from Tormento. In the next succeeding novel, La de Bringas, the aspiration is gratified. The Bringas family are installed in the palace, in the quarters assigned to the employees of the royal household. The efforts of two of their acquaintances to find them, in the puzzling intricacies of the place, are thus amusingly described. Above stairs in a royal palace, from La de Bringas. Well, this is about the way it was. We threw ourselves bravely into this interminable corridor, a veritable street, or alley at least, paved with red tiles, feebly lighted with gas jets, and full of doublings and twistings. Now and then it spread out into broad openings like little plazas, inundated with sunlight which entered through large openings from the main courtyard. This illumination penetrated lengthwise along the white walls of the narrow passageways, alleys, or tunnels, or whatever they may be called, growing ever feebler and more uncertain as it went, till finally it fainted away entirely at sight of the fan-shaped yellow gas flames, smoking little circles upon their protecting metal discs. There were uncounted panel doors with numbers on them, some newly painted and others moldering and weather-stained, but not one displaying the figure we were seeking. At this one you would see a rich silken bell cord, some happy find in the royal upholstery shop, while the next had nothing more than a poor frayed rope's end, and these were an indication of what was likely to be found within, as to order and neatness or disarray, and squalor. So, too, the mats of bits of carpet lay before the doors, threw a useful light upon the character of the lodgings. We came upon vacant apartments with cobwebs spun across the openings, and the door gratings thick with dust, and through broken transoms drew chill draughts that conveyed the breath of silence and desolation. Even whole precincts were abandoned, and the vaultings of unequal height returned the sound of our footsteps hollowly to our ears. We passed up one stairway, then down another, and then, as likely as not, we would ascend again. The labyrinthine maze led us on and ever onward. "It is useless to come here," at length said Perez, decidedly losing patience, "without charts and a mariner's compass. I suppose we are now in the south wing of the palace. The roofs down there must be those of the Hall of Commons and the outer stairway, are they not? What a huge mass of a place! The roofs of which he spoke were great pyramidal shapes protected with lead, and they covered in the ceilings on which bay-used frescoed cherubs cut their lively pigeon wings, and pirouettes. Still going on and onward without pause, we found ourselves shut up in a place without exit, a considerable enclosure lighted from the top, and we had to turn round and beat a retreat by way we had entered. Anyone who knows the palace and its symmetrical grandeur only from without could never divine all these irregularities that constitute a veritable small town in its upper regions. In truth, for an entire century there has been one continual modifying of the original plan, a stopping up here and an opening there, a condemning of staircases, a widening of some rooms at the expense of others, a changing of corridors into living rooms and of living rooms into corridors, and a cutting through of partitions and a shutting up of windows. You fall in with stairways that begin but never arrive anywhere, and with balconies that are but the made-over roof coverings of dwelling places below. These dovecoves were once stately drawing rooms, and on the other hand, these fine salons have been made out of the enclosing space of a grand staircase. Then again, winding stairs are frequent, but if you should take them, heaven knows what would become of you. And frequent, too, are glazed doors permanently closed, with naught behind them but silence, dust, and darkness. We are looking for the apartment of Don Francisco Bringas. Bringas? Yes, said an old woman. You're close to it. All you have to do is go down the first circular stairway you come to and then make a half-turn. Bringas? Yes, to be sure. He's sacristan of the chapel. Sacristan? He? What is the matter with you? He is head clerk of the administrative department. Oh, then he must be lower down, just off the terrace. I suppose you know your way to the fountain? No, not we. You know the stairs called the Secretary's staircase? No, not that either. At any rate, you know where the oratory is. We know nothing about it. But the choir of the oratory, but the dovecotes. Sum total, we had not the slightest acquaintance with any of their conjuries of winding turns, sudden tricks, and baffling surprises. The architectural arrangement was a mad caprice, a mocking jest at all plan and symmetry. Nevertheless, despite our notable lack of experience, we stuck to our quest, and even carried our infatuation so far as to reject the services of a boy who offered himself as our guide. We are now in the wing facing on the Plaza di Oriente, said Perez. That is to say, at exactly the opposite extreme from the wing in which our friend resides. His geographical notions were delivered with the gravity and conviction of some character in Jules Verne. Hence, the problem now demanding our attention is by what route to get from here to the western wing. In the first place, the cupola of the chapel and the grand stairway roof covering furnish us with a certain basis. We should take our bearings from them. I assume that, having once arrived in the western wing, we shall be numbskulls indeed if we do not strike Bringas's abode. All the same, I for one will never return to these outlandish regions without a pocket compass, and what is more, without a good supply of provender too, against such emergencies as this. Before striking out on the new stage of our explorations, as thus projected, we paused to look down from the window. The Plaza di Oriente lay below us in a beautiful panorama, and beyond it a portion of Madrid crested with at least 50 cupolas, steeples, and bell towers. The equestrian Philip IV appeared a mere toy, and the Royal Theatre a paltry shed. The doves had their nests far below where we stood, and we saw them, by pairs or larger groups, plunge headlong downward into the dizzy abyss, and then presently come whirling upward again, with swift and graceful motion, and settle on the carved capitals and mouldings. It is credibly stated that all the political revolutions do not matter a jot to these doves, and there is nothing either in the ancient pile they inhabit or in the free realms of air around it to limit their sway. They remain undisputed masters of the place. Away we go once more. Perez begins to put the geographical notions he has acquired from the books of Jules Verne yet further into practice. At every step he stops to say to me, "Now we are making our way northward. We shall undoubtedly soon find a road or trail on our right leading to the west. There is no cause to be alarmed in descending this winding stairway to the second story. Good, it is done. Well, bless me, where are we now? I don't see the main dome any longer, not so much as a lightning rod of it. We are in the realms of the feebly flickering gas once more. Suppose we ascend again by the other stairway luckily just at hand. What now? Well, here we are back again in the eastward wing and nothing else, just where we were before. Are we? No. Yes. See, down there in the court the big dome is still on our right. There's a regular grove of chimney stacks. You may believe it or not, but this sort of thing begins to make my head swim. It seems as if the whole place gave a lurch now and then, like a ship at sea. The fountain must be over that way, do you see? For the maids are coming and going from there with their pitchers. Oh, well, I, for one, give the whole thing up. We want a guide and an expert, or we'll never get out of this. I can't take another step. We've walked miles and I can't stand on my legs. Hey there, halloo, send us a guide. Oh, for a guide. Get me out of this infernal tangle, quickly. We came at last to Brinkus's apartment. When we got there, we understood how we must have passed it earlier without knowing it, for its number was quite rubbed out and invisible. Translation of William Henry Bishop. End of section 31.
Section 32 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avayi in April 2022. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 15, by Various. The Comparative Worth of Different Races, by Francis Galton. Francis Galton, born 1822. The modern doctrine of heredity regards man less as an individual than as a link in a series, involuntarily inheriting and transmitting a number of peculiarities, physical and mental. The general acceptance of this doctrine would necessitate a modification of popular ethical conceptions and consequently of social conditions. Except Darwin, probably no one has done so much to place the doctrine on a scientific basis as Francis Galton, whose brilliant researches have sought to establish the hereditary nature of psychical as well as physical qualities. Mr. Galton first took up the subject of the transmissibility of intellectual gifts in his Hereditary Genius, 1869. An examination of the relationships of the judges of England for a period of 200 years, of the statesmen of the time of George III, of the premiers of the last 100 years, and of a certain selection of divines and modern scholars, together with the kindred of the most illustrious commanders, men of letters and science, poets, painters, and musicians of all times and nations, resulted in his conclusion that man's mental abilities are derived by inheritance under exactly the same limitations as are the forms and features of the whole organic world. Mr. Galton argued that, as it is practicable to produce a highly gifted race of men by judicious marriages during several consecutive generations, the state ought to encourage by dowries and other artificial means such marriages as make for the elevation of the race. Having set forth the hereditary nature of general intellectual ability, he attempts to discover what particular qualities commonly combine to form genius, and whether they also are transmissible. English Men of Science, Their Nature and Nurture, 1874, was a summary of the results obtained from inquiries addressed to the most eminent scientific men of England, respecting the circumstances of heredity and environment which might have been influential in directing them toward their careers. 180 persons were questioned. From the replies it appeared that in the order of their prevalence, the chief qualities that commonly unite to form scientific genius are energy, both of body and mind, good health, great independence of character, tenacity of purpose, practical business habits, and strong innate tastes for science generally, or for some branch of it. The replies indicated the hereditary character of the qualities in question, showing incidentally that in the matter of heredity the influence of the father is greater than that of the mother. It would have been interesting to have had the results of similar inquiries in the case of other classes of eminent persons, statesmen, lawyers, poets, divines, etc. However, it is problematical whether other classes would have entered so heartily into the spirit of the inquiry and given such full and frank replies. Large variation in individuals from their parents is, he argues, not only not incompatible with the strict doctrine of heredity, but is a consequence of it wherever the breed is impure. Likewise, abnormal attributes of individual parents are less transmissible than the general characteristics of the family. Both these influences operate to deprive the science of heredity of the certainty of prediction in individual cases. The latter influence, that is, the law of reversion, is made the subject of a separate inquiry in the volume entitled Natural Inheritance, 1889. In Inquiries into the Human Faculty and its Development, 1883, he described a method of accurately measuring mental processes, such as sensation, volition, the formation of elementary judgments, and the estimation of numbers, suggested composite photography as a means of studying the physiognomy of criminal and other classes, treated the subject of heredity in crime, and discussed the mental process of visualizing. Fingerprints, 1892, is a study from the point of view of heredity of the patterns observed in the skin of fingertips. These patterns are not only hereditary, but also furnish a certain means of identification, an idea improved in Mark Twain's story of Pudd'nhead Wilson. Mr. Galton is himself an example of the heredity of genius, being a grandson of Erasmus Darwin, the author of Zoonomia, and a cousin of Charles Darwin. Born near Birmingham in 1822, he studied some time at Birmingham Hospital and at King's College, London, with the intention of entering the medical profession, but abandoned his design and was graduated from Trinity College, Cambridge, in 1844. He soon after made 2 journeys of exploration in Africa, the latter of which is described in his Narrative of an Explorer in South Africa, 1853. An indirect result of these journeys was The Art of Travel, or Shifts and Contrivances in Wild Countries, 1855. Meteorographica, 1863, is noteworthy as the first attempt ever made to represent in charts on a large scale the progress of the weather, and on account of the theory of anticyclones, which Mr. Galton advances in it. Although strictly scientific in aim and method, Mr. Galton's writings, particularly those on heredity, appeal to all classes of readers, and possess a distinct literary value. One may admire in them simplicity and purity of diction, animation of style, fertility in the construction of theory, resourcefulness in the search for proof, and a fine enthusiasm for the subject under consideration. The comparative worth of different races. From Hereditary Genius. Every long-established race has necessarily its peculiar fitness for the conditions under which it has lived, owing to the sure operation of Darwin's law of natural selection. However, I am not much concerned for the present with the greater part of those aptitudes, but only with such as are available in some form or other of high civilization. We may reckon upon the advent of a time when civilization, which is now sparse and feeble and far more superficial than it is vaunted to be, shall overspread the globe. Ultimately it is sure to do so, because civilization is the necessary fruit of high intelligence when found in a social animal, and there is no plainer lesson to be read off the face of nature than that the result of the operation of her laws is to evoke intelligence in connection with sociability. Intelligence is as much an advantage to an animal as physical strength or any other natural gift, and therefore, out of two varieties of any race of animal who are equally endowed in other respects, the most intelligent variety is sure to prevail in the battle of life. Similarly, among animals as intelligent as man, the most social race is sure to prevail, other qualities being equal. Under even a very moderate form of material civilization, a vast number of aptitudes acquired through the survivorship of the fittest and the unsparing destruction of the unfit for hundreds of generations have become as obsolete as the old mail coach habits and customs since the establishment of railroads, and there is not the slightest use in attempting to preserve them. They are hindrances and not gains to civilization. I shall refer to some of these a little further on, but I will first speak of the qualities needed in civilized society. They are, speaking generally, such as will enable a race to supply a large contingent to the various groups of eminent men of whom I have treated in my several chapters. Without going so far as to say that this very convenient test is perfectly fair, we are at all events justified in making considerable use of it, as I will do in the estimates I am about to give. In comparing the worth of different races, I shall make frequent use of the law of deviation from an average, to which I have already been much beholden, and to save the reader's time and patience, I propose to act upon an assumption that would require a good deal of discussion to limit, and to which the reader may at first demur, but which cannot lead to any error of importance in a rough provisional inquiry. I shall assume that the intervals between the grades of ability are the same in all the races. I know this cannot be strictly true, for it would be in defiance of analogy if the variability of all races were precisely the same, but on the other hand there is good reason to expect that the error introduced by the assumption cannot sensibly affect the off-hand results for which alone I propose to employ it. Moreover, the rough data I shall adduce will go far to show the justice of this expectation. Let us then compare the Negro race with the Anglo-Saxon, with respect to those qualities alone which are capable of producing judges, statesmen, commanders, men of literature and science, poets, artists, and divines. If the Negro race in America had been affected by no social disabilities, a comparison of their achievements with those of the whites in their several branches of intellectual effort, having regard to the total number of their respective populations, would give the necessary information. As matters stand, we must be content with much rougher data. First, the Negro race has occasionally, but very rarely, produced such men as Toussaint Louverture. Secondly, the Negro race is by no means wholly deficient in men capable of becoming good factors, thriving merchants, and otherwise considerably raised above the average of whites. Thirdly, we may compare, but with much caution, the relative position of Negroes in their native country with that of the travelers who visit them. The latter no doubt bring with them the knowledge current in civilized lands, but that is an advantage of less importance than we are apt to suppose. The native chief has as good an education in the art of ruling men as can be desired. He is continually exercised in personal government, and usually maintains his place by the ascendancy of his character, shown every day over his subjects and rivals. A traveller in wild countries also fills to a certain degree the position of a commander, and has to confront native chiefs at every inhabited place. The result is familiar enough. The white traveller almost invariably holds his own in their presence. It is seldom that we hear of a white traveller meeting with a black chief whom he feels to be the better man. I have often discussed this subject with competent persons, and can only recall a few cases of the inferiority of the white man, certainly not more than might be ascribed to an average actual difference of 3 grades, of which one may be due to the relative demerits of native education, and the remaining 2 to a difference in natural gifts. Fourthly, the number among the Negroes of those whom we should call half-witted men is very large. Every book alluding to Negro servants in America is full of instances. I was myself much impressed by this fact during my travels in Africa. The mistakes the Negroes made in their own matters were so childish, stupid, and simpleton-like as frequently to make me ashamed of my own species. I do not think it any exaggeration to say that their C is as low as our E, which would be a difference of 2 grades, as before. I have no information as to actual idiocy among the Negroes. I mean, of course, of that class of idiocy which is not due to disease. The Australian type is at least 1 grade below the African Negro. I possess a few serviceable data about the natural capacity of the Australian, but not sufficient to induce me to invite the reader to consider them. The average standard of the Lowland Scotch and the English North Countrymen is decidedly a fraction of a grade superior to that of the ordinary English, because the number of the former who attain to eminence is far greater than the proportionate number of their race would have led us to expect. The same superiority is distinctly shown by a comparison of the well-being of the masses of the population, for the Scotch labourer is much less of a drudge than the Englishman of the Midland counties. He does his work better, and lives his life besides. The peasant women of Northumberland work all day in the fields, and are not broken down by the work. On the contrary, they take a pride in their effective labour as girls, and when married, they attend well to the comfort of their homes. It is perfectly distressing to me to witness the draggled, drudged, mean look of the mass of individuals, especially of the women, that one meets in the streets of London and other purely English towns. The conditions of their life seem too hard for their constitutions, and to be crushing them into degeneracy. The ablest race of whom history bears record is unquestionably the ancient Greek, partly because their masterpieces in the principal departments of intellectual activity are still unsurpassed and in many respects unequaled, and partly because the population that gave birth to the creators of those masterpieces was very small. Of the various Greek sub-races, that of Attica was the ablest, and she was no doubt largely indebted to the following cause for her superiority. Athens opened her arms to immigrants, but not indiscriminately, for her social life was such that none but very able men could take any pleasure in it. On the other hand, she offered attractions such as men of the highest ability and culture could find in no other city. Thus, by a system of partly unconscious selection, she built up a magnificent breed of human animals, which in the space of 1 century, that is, between 530 and 430 B.C., produced the following illustrious persons, 14 in number: statesmen and commanders: Themistocles, mother an alien; Miltiades, Aristides, Cimon, son of Miltiades; Pericles, son of Xantippus, the victor at Mycale; literary and scientific men: Thucydides, Socrates, Xenophon, Plato. Poets: Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes. Sculptor: Phidias. We are able to make a closely approximate estimate of the population that produced these men, because the number of the inhabitants of Attica has been a matter of frequent inquiry, and critics appear at length to be quite agreed in the general results. The average ability of the Athenian race is, on the lowest possible estimate, very nearly 2 grades higher than our own, that is, about as much as our race is above that of the African Negro. This estimate, which may seem prodigious to some, is confirmed by the quick intelligence and high culture of the Athenian commonalty, before whom literary works were recited and works of art exhibited, of a far more severe character than could possibly be appreciated by the average of our race, the caliber of whose intellect is easily gauged by a glance at the contents of a railway bookstall. We know, and may guess something more, of the reason why this marvelously gifted race declined. Social morality grew exceedingly lax, marriage became unfashionable and was avoided. Many of the more ambitious and accomplished women were avowed courtesans and consequently infertile, and the mothers of the incoming population were of a heterogeneous class. In a small sea-bordered country, where emigration and immigration are constantly going on, and where the manners are as dissolute as were those of Greece in the period of which I speak, the purity of a race would necessarily fail. It can be therefore no surprise to us, though it has been a severe misfortune to humanity, that the high Athenian breed decayed and disappeared. For if it had maintained its excellence, and had multiplied and spread over large countries, displacing inferior populations, which it might well have done, for it was exceedingly prolific, it would assuredly have accomplished results advantageous to human civilization, to a degree that transcends our powers of imagination. If we could raise the average standard of our race only 1 grade, what vast changes would be produced. The number of men of natural gifts equal to those of the eminent men of the present day would be necessarily increased more than tenfold, but far more important to the progress of civilization would be the increase in the yet higher orders of intellect. We know how intimately the course of events is dependent on the thoughts of a few illustrious men. If the first-rate men in the different groups had never been born, even if those among them who have a place in my appendices on account of their hereditary gifts had never existed, the world would be very different to what it is. It seems to me most essential to the well-being of future generations that the average standard of ability of the present time should be raised. Civilization is a new condition imposed upon man by the course of events, just as in the history of geological changes new conditions have continually been imposed on different races of animals. They have had the effect either of modifying the nature of the races through the process of natural selection, whenever the changes were sufficiently slow and the race sufficiently pliant, or of destroying them altogether, when the changes were too abrupt or the race unyielding. The number of the races of mankind that have been entirely destroyed under the pressure of the requirements of an incoming civilization reads us a terrible lesson. Probably in no former period of the world has the destruction of the races of any animal whatever been effected over such wide areas, and with such startling rapidity as in the case of savage man. In the North American continent, in the West Indian Islands, in the Cape of Good Hope, in Australia, New Zealand, and Van Diemen's Land, the human denizens of vast regions have been entirely swept away in the short space of 3 centuries, less by the pressure of a stronger race than through the influence of a civilization they were incapable of supporting. And we, too, the foremost laborers in creating this civilization, are beginning to show ourselves incapable of keeping pace with our own work. The needs of centralization, communication, and culture call for more brains and mental stamina than the average of our race possesses. We are in crying want for a greater fund of ability in all stations of life, for neither the classes of statesmen, philosophers, artisans, nor laborers are up to the modern complexity of their several professions. An extended civilization like ours comprises more interests than the ordinary statesmen or philosophers of our present race are capable of dealing with, and it exacts more intelligent work than our ordinary artisans and laborers are capable of performing. Our race is overweighted and appears likely to be drudged into degeneracy by demands that exceed its powers. When the severity of the struggle for existence is not too great for the powers of the race, its action is healthy and conservative. Otherwise, it is deadly, just as we may see exemplified in the scanty, wretched vegetation that leads a precarious existence near the summer snow line of the Alps, and disappears altogether a little higher up. We want as much backbone as we can get, to bear the racket to which we are henceforth to be exposed, and as good brains as possible to contrive machinery for modern life to work more smoothly than at present. We can in some degree raise the nature of man to a level with the new conditions imposed upon his existence, and we can also in some degree modify the conditions to suit his nature. It is clearly right that both these powers should be exerted, with the view of bringing his nature and the conditions of his existence into as close harmony as possible. In proportion as the world becomes filled with mankind, the relations of society necessarily increase in complexity, and the nomadic disposition found in most barbarians becomes unsuitable to the novel conditions. There is a most unusual unanimity in respect to the causes of incapacity of savages for civilization, among writers on those hunting and migratory nations who are brought into contact with advancing colonization, and perish, as they invariably do, by the contact. They tell us that the labor of such men is neither constant nor steady, that the love of a wandering, independent life prevents their settling anywhere to work, except for a short time, when urged by want and encouraged by kind treatment. Meadows says that the Chinese call the barbarous races on their borders by a phrase which means hither and thither, not fixed. And any amount of evidence might be adduced to show how deeply Bohemian habits of one kind or another were ingrained in the nature of the men who inhabited most parts of the earth, now overspread by the Anglo-Saxon and other civilized races. Luckily, there is still room for adventure, and a man who feels the cravings of a roving, adventurous spirit to be too strong for resistance may yet find a legitimate outlet for it in the colonies, in the army, or on board ship. But such a spirit is, on the whole, an heirloom that brings more impatient restlessness and beating of the wings against cage bars than persons of more civilized characters can readily comprehend, and it is directly at war with the more modern portion of our moral natures. If a man be purely a nomad, he has only to be nomadic, and his instinct is satisfied, but no Englishmen of the 19th century are purely nomadic. The most so among them have also inherited many civilized cravings that are necessarily starved when they become wanderers, in the same way as the wandering instincts are starved when they are settled at home. Consequently, their nature has opposite wants, which can never be satisfied except by chance, through some very exceptional turn of circumstances. This is a serious calamity, and as the Bohemianism in the nature of our race is destined to perish, the sooner it goes, the happier for mankind. The social requirements of English life are steadily destroying it. No man who only works by fits and starts is able to obtain his living nowadays, for he has not a chance of thriving in competition with steady workmen. If his nature revolts against the monotony of daily labor, he is tempted to the public house, to intemperance, and it may be to poaching, and to much more serious crime. Otherwise he banishes himself from our shores. In the first case he is unlikely to leave as many children as men of more domestic and marrying habits, and in the second case his breed is wholly lost to England. By this steady riddance of the bohemian spirit of our race, the artisan part of our population is slowly becoming bred to its duties, and the primary qualities of the typical modern British workman are already the very opposite of those of the nomad. What they are now was well described by Mr. Chadwick as consisting of great bodily strength applied under the command of a steady, persevering will, mental self-contentedness, impassibility to external irrelevant impressions, which carries them through the continued repetition of toilsome labor, steady as time. It is curious to remark how unimportant to modern civilization has become the once famous and thoroughbred-looking Norman. The type of his features, which is probably in some degree correlated with his peculiar form of adventurous disposition, is no longer characteristic of our rulers, and is rarely found among celebrities of the present day. It is more often met with among the undistinguished members of highly born families, and especially among the less conspicuous officers of the army. Modern leading men in all paths of eminence, as may easily be seen in a collection of photographs, are of a coarser and more robust breed, less excitable and dashing, but endowed with far more ruggedness and real vigor. Such also is the case as regards the German portion of the Austrian nation. Much more alien to the genius of an enlightened civilization than the nomadic habit is the impulsive and uncontrolled nature of the savage. A civilized man must bear and forbear. He must keep before his mind the claims of the morrow as clearly as those of the passing minute, of the absent as well as of the present. This is the most trying of the new conditions imposed on man by civilization, and the one that makes it hopeless for any but exceptional natures among savages to live under them. The instinct of a savage is admirably consonant with the needs of savage life. Every day he is in danger through transient causes. He lives from hand to mouth, in the hour and for the hour, without care for the past or forethought for the future. But such an instinct is utterly at fault in civilized life. The half-reclaimed savage, being unable to deal with more subjects of consideration than are directly before him, is continually doing acts through mere maladroitness and incapacity, at which he is afterwards deeply grieved and annoyed. The nearer inducements always seem to him, through his uncorrected sense of moral perspective, to be incomparably larger than others of the same actual size, but more remote. Consequently, when the temptation of the moment has been yielded to and passed away, and its bitter result comes in its turn before the man, he is amazed and remorseful at his past weakness. It seems incredible that he should have done that yesterday, which today seems so silly, so unjust, and so unkindly. The newly reclaimed barbarian, with the impulsive, unstable nature of the savage, when he also chances to be gifted with a peculiarly generous and affectionate disposition, is of all others the man most oppressed with the sense of sin. Now it is a just assertion, and a common theme of moralists of many creeds, that man, such as we find him, is born with an imperfect nature. He has lofty aspirations, but there is a weakness in his disposition which incapacitates him from carrying his nobler purposes into effect. He sees that some particular course of action is his duty, and should be his delight, but his inclinations are fickle and base, and do not conform to his better judgment. The whole moral nature of man is tainted with sin, which prevents him from doing the things he knows to be right. The explanation I offer to this apparent anomaly seems perfectly satisfactory from a scientific point of view. It is neither more nor less than that the development of our nature, whether under Darwin's law of natural selection, or through the effects of changed ancestral habits, has not yet overtaken the development of our moral civilization. Man was barbarous but yesterday, and therefore it is not to be expected that the natural aptitudes of his race should already have become molded into accordance with his very recent advance. We, men of the present centuries, are like animals suddenly transplanted among new conditions of climate and of food. Our instincts fail us under the altered circumstances. My theory is confirmed by the fact that the members of old civilizations are far less sensible than recent converts from barbarism, of their nature being inadequate to their moral needs. The conscience of a Negro is aghast at his own wild, impulsive nature, and is easily stirred by a preacher, but it is scarcely possible to ruffle the self-complacency of a steady-going Chinaman. The sense of original sin would show, according to my theory, not that man was fallen from high estate, but that he was rising in moral culture with more rapidity than the nature of his race could follow. My view is corroborated by the conclusion reached at the end of each of the many independent lines of ethnological research, that the human race were utter savages in the beginning, and that after myriads of years of barbarism, man has but very recently found his way into the paths of morality and civilization. End of section 32.
Section 33 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Doc D.L. Martin. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 15, by Various. Arne Garborg, 1851, The Conflict of the Creed. Arne Garborg, 1851. Arne Garborg is one of the most potent forces in the new school of Norwegian literature, the contemporary of Alexander Kielland, who is more widely known abroad. He is, however, the representative of a vastly different phase. Kielland's works, except for their setting, are the result of general European culture, whereas Garborg has laid the foundations of a literature essentially Norse. The new literature of young Norway is a true exponent of its social conditions. The ferment of its strivings and its discontent permeates the whole people. Much of Garborg's work is the chronicle of this social unrest, particularly among the peasant classes, where he himself by birth belongs. In the reaction against the sentimental idealism of the older school, he is the pioneer who has blazed the paths. Where Björnson gives rose-colored pictures of what peasant life might be, Garborg, with heavy strokes of terrible meaning, draws the outline of what it is. His daring and directness of speech aroused a storm of opposition, and he has also been made to suffer in a material way for the courage of his opinions, in that the position which he had held in the government service since 1879 was taken from him as a consequence of his books. Arne Garborg was born at Jæren in the southwestern part of Norway, January 1851. The circumstances of his life were humble, and all of his surroundings were meager in the extreme. His father, a village schoolmaster, was a man of nervous, fanatical temperament, with whom religion was a mania. In the obscure little village where he lived, Garborg's boyhood was outwardly uneventful, but inwardly filled with conflict. Brought up in an atmosphere of pietism, the natural reaction led him into a kind of romantic, atheistic unbelief. In the turmoil of his mind, the battles were fought again and again, until at length he reached the middle ground of modern thought. His education was extremely desultory, but from the age of 9, when from the only models within his reach he wrote hymns and sermons, He showed a strong tendency for literature. He passed the required examinations for a schoolteacher in 1870 and alternately taught and studied until in 1875 he entered the University of Christiania. His life as a student was by no means smooth, but he persisted in spite of poverty and indeed sometimes actual want. He had previously in Rysor published a teacher's journal, 1871, a small paper dealing principally, though not exclusively, with school affairs, and a year later, in Vetstrand, he published the Vetstrand Post. This experience as county editor and printer had qualified him for newspaper work, and in 1877 he became connected with the Aftenbladet of Christiania. The same year he founded the Fædrehimen, a weekly paper for the Norse people. This was really the beginning of his literary career, although besides his early enterprises in journalism, he had, as a student, contributed occasional articles to the newspapers, and had already published his first book, a critical essay on Ibsen's Emperor and Galilean. The attempt made by Ivar Aasen to establish in Norway a national language through a normalization of the peasant dialects found in Garborg one of its warmest supporters. Discarding Danish as a literary medium, he advocated the use of the strong Norse, and the Fædrehimen appeared as the organ of the new movement. Garborg wrote a book upon the subject in the year after the establishment of his journal, and ever since, by precept and practice, he has been the chief propagandist of the new speech. His first novel, In Frithingjar, a freethinker, appeared anonymously in the Fædrehimen in 1878. The subject of the story was one of the vital questions of the day, the conflict between iron-bound dogmatism and rational thought, a theme now threadbare with much handling, but then startlingly new. The author's early training and his own environment of intolerant theology supplied material for the story. The hero of the tale, the man who dared to think for himself, was looked upon as a criminal, to be ranked with housebreakers and thieves. The ostracism which he brought upon himself was but the just punishment for his crimes. The freethinker, treated as a moral leper, is driven from his home and goes abroad to expiate his sin of unorthodoxy. In later years he returns to his native land to find most of his acquaintances dead. Of his family only one still lives, and that is his son, who has become a clergyman. Garborg's second romance, Bondestudentar, Peasant Students, 1883, deals with a problem no less real in Norway. Although there is no rank of nobility, class distinctions are nevertheless strongly marked, and in this novel his pen is directed against the evils which result from the inordinate striving of the lower orders for a position to which they are unfitted, both by nature and circumstances. This book, again, is to a degree autobiographical, for Garborg, as has been said, is himself peasant, and he has fought the fight and suffered the anguish of the new culture attained with incalculable sacrifice. Peasant Students is undoubtedly his greatest work. Nowhere else has he indicated more clearly his seriousness of purpose, or worked out his theme with more effectiveness. The hero, Daniel Brout, is the representative of the ideal student, a son of the people who shall strive for poetry and the soul, and introduce the elements of culture among his class. Manual labor is his aversion, and at last, forced by the weakness of his nature and the necessity of his poverty, he goes over to the ranks of Philistinism, marries a woman of property, and studies theology. Both books are stories of high ideals and humiliating compromises. The author's pessimism is in the ascendant, and in the end the lower nature conquers. In Monfolk, 1886, he takes up a different theme, the relation of the sexes, a question which he treats with startling frankness. Garborg is a realist insofar that he prefers to depict life as it is. well knowing that fiction cannot approach truth in point of interest. He bears true testimony of what he sees and knows, but his realism is very far removed from the naturalism of the French school. Following peasant students appeared in 1884 Fortlinger og Soger, Narratives and Tales, a volume of stories dealing sometimes with subjects generally prescribed. Of his other works, the most important are the narrative Ja på mor with Mama, Kolbottenbrev og Andre Skildringer, Kolbotten Letters and Other Sketches, 1890, the novels Trot Mend, Weary Souls, 1891, Fred, Peace, 1893, and the drama Uforsaliga, The Irreconcilables, 1888. After being deprived of his government position upon the publication of Monfolk, Arne Garborg retired with his wife and child into the solitude of the mountains, where for 2 years he lived and wrote in his cider hut. But at last, overcome by the loneliness of this isolated life, he left Norway and settled in Germany. The conflict of the creeds. From A Free Thinker, the noise of carriage wheels increased. The carriage drove up before the door, and all the people of the parsonage sprang up in joy. Ragna, however, reddened somewhat. A minute after, both Hans Frangen and Eystein Hauck stood in the room. Hans embraced his parents and his sister, and on the surface was happy. Hauck greeted them kindly and warmly, like an acquaintance of the family, and bowed deep before Ragna. "A good evening to you, and a Merry Christmas time," called out Hans. "Here is the great foreign traveler and wise man Eystein Hauck, and here," he pointed to the chaplain, "is the strict man of God, Bale, chaplain now, pastor later on, finally bishop, a well-founded theologian and a true support to the church in these distracted times. It will be well with you if you do not fall into a quarrel about belief." There was talking and laughing. The pastor's wife poured out wine. The newcomers sat down. The table was quickly set, and then they went into the dining room, where Christmas grits and Christmas fish stood smoking in a great dish, and awaited the help of the people. The pastor read a blessing, which was not listened to with any further devoutness. Ragna and Bale sat for the most part and looked at Hauck, but Hauck looked at Ragna, and the pastor's wife said of Hans how he had grown during the past year, and how his good looks and his affability had improved. The one who talked most at the table was Hans. Hauck was rather silent. The pastor asked him in a few words about his travels abroad. He answered promptly but shortly, and often in such a cleverly turned way of speaking that it was difficult to find out his real meaning. The chaplain, too, would have liked to hear about foreign lands. What was the state of the Christian religion in France? Well, it was various. It was there as here. There were people of all sorts. But was not the great majority unchristian? Well, of enlightened and learned people it was, to be sure, the smallest part who strictly could be called Christians. But with morals, was there not a great deal of social viciousness and impropriety? Well, if it were only considered under certain conditions, in certain cities, it was probably there as in other places. Indeed, Bale, rebuffed, looked away from Hauck, and did not talk with him afterward. When they left the table, there was set out dessert, with wine, and pipes were also brought. The conversation went on as before, but it was none the less Hans who talked most. He was a fresh, happy fellow. His mother sat and found pleasure in looking at him. The pastor and Bale sat and smoked, glanced now and then at Hauck, who was a little way off at a smaller table, talking small talk with Ragna. The pastor had become more silent, and Bale looked as if he little liked the state of things, although he tried to control himself. Hans understood this and laughed. "Do not bother yourself about Hauck," said he. He has been in Paris and has learned French manners, and consequently he likes women's society best. But even if he is a little grand, he will quickly become Norse again, keep to his pipe and his glass, and let the women take care of themselves." Bale bit his lips. The pastor smiled a little. "Young people are more bashful here in Norway," said he. "That is true," he continued. "You have read the new novel Virginia that the people have waited so long for?" "Virginia? Poof! That is a vile book," answered Hans, and smiled. "Vile?" said the chaplain questioningly. "It is a scandalous book," says Christiania. "It has set the whole town on end. It works destruction upon marriage, they say, upon morals, upon society. I have never seen Christiania so moral as in these days." Said Bale. "Christiania is on the whole a moral town." "It is at this time. The young poets are happy for all the days of their life. The men forbid the women to read the book, and the women forbid their daughters, and so they all read it together," said the pastor. "Certainly, the women read it and say, 'Pah! The poets do not know life.' The daughters, the poor dear angels, they read it and say, 'Dear me, is that anything? Have we not read worse books than that?' But tell us then what the book is about," said the pastor. "It is about that married people shall love each other," said Hans stoutly. "Oho, free love," called out the chaplain. "Certainly, free love, all true love is free," says the foolhardy fellow of a poet. "Do you hear that, pastor?" said Bale. "If our own poets also take it up, let us have a care. Then he recognizes free thought, and what then?" asked the chaplain. "That is true," replied Hans. "All thoughts are free, he says, and not merely duty-free. Of course, he does not believe in God? I doubt it, but even that is not the worst. Not the... No, for there are many people in Christiania who do not believe in God. But these poets do not even believe in the devil." Hans laughed like a child at the face that the chaplain made. The pastor looked severely at Hans, who cast down his eyes and was silent. "Worthless fruit," sighed the chaplain. "Our poets have hitherto kept themselves free from these godless thoughts, even if they have not always had the right opinion of Christianity, and particularly have taken up the confusions of Grundtvigianism. But now, it has taken another path. Do you see the spirit of revolt, pastor? Do you hear how they rise and tear asunder all its bonds? How opposition arises against all that is high and holy, and they storm even against the foundations of society?" "May God help us," sighed the pastor. "It does not look right. Is there anything new in the newspapers?" he asked, as if to get away from a conversation that plainly oppressed him. Hans ran out and came quickly in again with the newspapers. Such of these as were French he took for himself, the rest he gave to Bale. "Do you see, father," said Hans with the mien of a schoolmaster, "if you will have politics, you must turn to France. All other politics are merely an echo of theirs. France is Europe. France is the world. Do you hear, pastor?" said Bale. "Do you hear how the French spirit spreads and increases in power? The French spirit, which has always been one and the same with rationalism and revolution." "Here is an article that will do Bale good," called out Hans. "It does not assume the good tone or prattle tediously like our Norse newspaper articles. There is fire and burning in it. You recognize something like a clenched fist back of the words, prepared for everything upon which it may hit. That is what I call politics." "Oh, you are a foolish fellow," said the pastor. "Come, out with it." Hans read an article against the priestly party or clericals, and the piece was severely radical. It was particularly to the effect that the clergy and Christianity must be ousted from the public schools, if thinkers were to be really for a genuine and sound popular education. Christianity had already done what it could do. Hereafter it lay merely in the way. Freedom and self-government was the war cry now for this generation. They might be fair enough, many of the dreams which the new time compelled us to abandon, but light and life and truth were 10 times fairer than all dreams. The chaplain sat and sulked and looked into one of the Norse papers. "Here stands the same," said he. "No, but—" "Yes, the same, and yet not the same. The Norse paper has cut out or changed all that treats directly of Christianity. The rest is the same." "Ha, ha, ha," laughed Hans. "Yes, they are as wise as serpents," sighed the chaplain. "Here may plainly be seen how the matter stands. It is hidden away in politics, but the spirit they cannot conceal. It is precisely the same French spirit of hell, the spirit of revolt, the spirit of the devil, which lifts itself against even the living God. Do you see that, Pastor? Do you see how wholly these freedom politics, as they are called, are held up and impregnated with this godless spirit of revolt? In truth, it becomes more and more clear that it is the part of us, the watchmen of Zion, more now than ever before, to watch and pray." The pastor sat and meditated. He looked depressed and sorrowful. It was too quiet for Hans. He moved away to Hauk and Brugna. The chaplain appeared to like this, and became more calm. "Dear pastor," said he after a while, "just as surely as there is truth in our work, yes, this question presses itself more and more in upon me, as surely as there is truth in our work, that we shall watch over God's house and people, we cannot remain silent and be calm when we see a spirit like this coming bearing in upon us, a spirit which is directly founded upon heathenism and so plainly shows its satanic origin. Shall it be? Can we answer for that before our Lord and God?" The pastor was silent. He was in great doubt and uncertainty of mind. "I do not believe that it is right to bring politics into the house of God," said he at last. "Politics, no, but this is not politics. This is a spirit of the times, a view of life which takes the outward garb of politics, but at the bottom is merely a new outbreak of the same old heathenism that the church at all times has had to contend with. I, for my part, do not believe that I can keep silent with a quiet conscience." The pastor held his peace and thought. "This is a hard question," he said finally. "May our Lord give us wisdom." "Amen," said the chaplain. That night the old pastor did not sleep well. He walked up and down his chamber and thought. "When it comes to the point," said he to himself, "Bale is right. There is something bad and evil in the spirit of the time. There is something devilish. Merely look, now, at this Eystein Haupt, this clever, fine fellow. He is not to be got at. He is frozen to ice and hardened to steel, slippery and smooth as a serpent. There came such an uncanny spirit from him that he made me downright sick. No respect, no veneration even for his own father. God knows how he can hold fast to his Christian faith. They call it freedom, humanity, but it is not that. It is hate, venom, bad blood. They will tear from them all bonds, as Bale says, raise a revolt against all that is beautiful and good, against God, against belief. Build the state, this whole earthly life, upon a heathen foundation. Sever connection with Christianity, cast the church away from them like old trash. That is terrible. And free love, free thought, the Christian religion out of the schools. No, that is Satan himself who rages. Free thoughts in my time were not so. They were warm and beautiful. There was heart in them. They made us good and happy. He shook himself as if to throw off a chill. Should one be silent at such things? Should one look quietly on while this evil spirit eats itself in among the people? Or should one, like a disciple of God, lift up the sword of the word and the spirit against this poisonous basilisk? He read in the Bible and in Luther. Then he got up again and walked. The clock struck hour after hour, but the old man did not hear it. He thought only of the heavy responsibility. Was it not to profane the house of God and the holy office, to drag the struggle and strife of the day into it? Was he not set to watch over word and teaching, but not to be a judge in the world's disputes? But of his flock, the people of the church, the bride of Christ, whom he should watch, but who stood in the midst of a wicked world, and whose souls were harmed when such evil gusts blew, would not every soul at the judgment day be demanded at his hands? And was he a good shepherd, who indeed kept watch against the wolf, when the wolf came having on his right garb, but looked on and was silent when he came, clothed in sheep's garments, and pretended to belong among the good? He read anew in Luther. At last he knelt down and prayed for a long time, and ended with a fervent and heartfelt Our Father. Then he arose, as if freed from doubt, looked meekly up to heaven, and said, As thou wilt, O Lord. He seated himself in his armchair, weary but happy, and fell asleep for a while. Presently, however, the day grew gray in the east, and he awoke. He read the morning prayers to himself, chose his text, and thought about the sermon. When the bell began to ring, he went to church. He was pale, but calm and kindly. The farmers looked at him and greeted him more warmly than usual. The pastor's wife, Aunt Ragna, came shortly after. Hans and Eystein did not arrive at the church until the pastor stood in the pulpit. The Christmas sermon was fervid and good. He spoke about the angel's song, Peace on Earth. They had seldom heard the old man preach so well, but at the end came a turn in the thought that caused some astonishment. It was about politics. Dear Christians, he said, how is it in our days with peace on earth? Ah, my brothers, we know that all too well. Peace has gone from us. It has vanished like a beautiful evening cloud. Evil powers rise up in these hours. The devil is abroad and tempts anew mankind to eat of the tree of knowledge and to tear themselves loose from God. Take heed, dear brothers. Take heed of the false prophets who proclaim a new gospel and promise you freedom and enlightenment and all that is good. Yes, promise you righteousness and power if you will eat of the forbidden tree. They give themselves out for sheep, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. They promise you freedom, but they give you thraldom, the thraldom of sin, which is the worst of all. They promise you blessings and joy, but they steal you away from him who alone has blessings and freedom for our poor race. They promise you security and defense against all tyranny and oppression, but they give you gladly into his power, who is the father of all tyranny and of all evil, he who is the destroyer of man from the beginning. Dear Christians, let us watch and pray. Let us prove the Spirit, whether it is from God. Let us harden our ears and our hearts against false voices and magic songs that deceive, which come to us out of the dark chasms and abysses in this wicked world. Let us be fearful of this wild and sinful thought of freedom that from Adam down has been the deep and true source of all our woe. Let us pray for peace on earth, for only then can our Lord have consideration for mankind. With this, he ended his sermon. Translated for A Library of the World's Best Literature by William H. Carpenter. End of section 33.
Section 34 of Library of the World's Greatest Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Robert Becours. Library of the World's Greatest Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 15 by Various. Selected Works by Hamlin Garland. Hamlin Garland, born 1860. Hamlin Garland is a favorable example of a class of young writers which is coming to the fore in the Middle West of the United States, fresh, original, full of faith and energy, with a robust and somewhat aggressive Americanism. In native endowment, he is a strong man, and his personal character is manly, clean, and high. At times, carelessness of technique and lack of taste can be detected in his writings, but his strength and spirit make amends for these defects. Mr. Garland was born September 16, 1860, in the La Crosse Valley, Wisconsin. His family is of Scotch descent, sturdy farmer folk, remarkable for their physical powers. His maternal grandfather was an Adventist, with the touch of mysticism that word implies. Garland was reared in the picturesque Coulee country, French Coulee means a dry gulch, living in various western towns, one of them being the Quaker community of Hesper, Iowa. His early education was received from the local schools. The unconscious assimilation of the Western ways came when he rode horses, herded cattle, and led the wholesome, simple, open-air life of the middle-class people. Some years were spent in a small seminary in Osage, Wisconsin, whence he was graduated at 21 years of age. His kin moved to Dakota, but Hamlin faced eastward, eager to see the world. 2 years of travel and teaching in Illinois found him in 1883 holding down a Dakota claim, the only result of the land boom being a rich field of literary ore. And then in 1884 he went to Boston, made his headquarters at the public library, read diligently, taught literature and elocution in the School of Oratory, and became one of the literary workers there, remaining until 1891. Since then, he has lectured much throughout the country and has settled in Chicago, his summer home being at West Salem, Wisconsin, in the beautiful Coulee region of his boyhood. Mr. Garland's main work is fiction, but he has also tried a hand at verse and essay. His volume, Crumbling Idols, published in 1894, a series of audacious papers in which the doctrine of realism is cried up and the appeal to past literary canons made a mock of, called out critical abuse and ridicule, and no doubt shows a lack of perspective. Yet the book is racy and stimulating to the extreme. The volume of poetry, Prairie Songs, from 1893, has the merit of dealing picturesquely and at first hand with Western scenery and life, and contains many a stroke of imaginative beauty. Of the half-dozen books of tales and longer stories, Main Traveled Roads, Mr. Garland's first collection of short stories, including work as striking as anything he has done, gives vivid pastoral pictures of the Mississippi Valley life. A Little Norsk, from 1893, along with its realism in sketching frontier scenes, possesses a fine romantic flavor. And Rose of Dutcher's Coulee, 1895, decidedly his strongest full-length fiction, is a delineation of Wisconsin rustic and urban life, including a study of Chicago, daringly unconventional but strong, earnest, and evidently drawn from the author's deepest experiences and convictions. Other books of fiction are Jason Edwards, A Member of the Third House, A Spoil of Office, and Prairie Folks. Mr. Garland's work, in its increasing command of art, its understanding of and sincere sympathy with the life of the great toiling population of the Middle West, and its unmistakable qualities of independence, vigor, and ideality, is worthy of warm praise. A rich, large nature is felt beneath his fiction. His literary creed is truth for truth's sake, and his conception of art is broad enough to include a love of country and belief in his fellow man. A Summer Mood, from Prairie Songs, copyright 1893 by Hamlin Garland, and published by Stone and Kimball. Oh, to be lost in the wind and the sun, to be one with the wind and the stream, with never a care while the waters run, with never a thought in my dream. To be part of the robin's lilting call, and part of the bobolink's rhyme, lying close to the sly thrush singing alone, and lapped in the cricket's chime. Oh, to live with these beautiful ones, with the lust and the glory of man, lost in the circuit of springtime suns, submissive as earth and part of her plan. To lie as the snake lies, content in the grass, to drift as the clouds drift, effortless, free, glad of the power that drives them on, with never a question of wind or sea. A Storm on Lake Michigan, from Rose of Dutcher's Coulee, copyright 1895 by Hamlin Garland, and published by Stone and Kimball. As the winter deepened, Rose narrowed the circle of conquest. She no longer thought of conquering the world. It came to be the question of winning the approbation of one human soul. That is, she wished to win the approbation of the world in order that Warren Mason might smile and say, "Well done." She did not reach this state of mind smoothly and easily. On the contrary, she had moments when she rebelled at the thought of any man's opinion being the greatest good in the world to her. She rebelled at the implied inferiority of her position in relation to him, and also at the physical bondage implied. In the morning, when she was strong, in the midst of some social success, when people swarmed about her and men bent deferentially, then she held herself like a soldier on a tower, defying capture. But at night, when the lights were all out, when she felt her essential loneliness and weakness and need, when the world seemed cold and cruel and selfish, then it seemed as if the sweetest thing in the universe would be to have him open his arms and say, "Come." There would be rest there, and repose, his judgment, his keen wit, his penetrating, powerful influence made him seem a giant to her, a giant who disdained effort and gave out an appearance of indifference and lassitude. Or she had known physical giants in her neighborhood who spoke in soft drawl and slouched lazily in action, but who were also invincible when aroused. She imagined she perceived in Mason a mental giant, who assumed irresolution and weakness for reasons of his own. He was always off duty when she saw him, and bent more upon rest than a display of power. Once or twice she saw him roused, and it thrilled her. That measured, lazy roll of voice changed to a quick, stern snarl. The brows lowered, and the big, plump face took on battle lines. It was like a seemingly shallow pool, suddenly disclosed to be of soundless depths by a wind of passion. The lake had been the refuge of the distracted and restless girl. She went to it often in the autumn days, for it rested her from the noise of grinding wheels and screams and yells. Its smooth rise and fall, its sparkle of whitecaps, its sailing gulls, filled her with delicious pleasure. It soothed her and roused her also. It gave her time to think. The street disturbed her, left her purposeless and powerless. But out there where the ships floated like shadows, and shadows shifted like flame, and the wind was keen and sweet, there she could get her mental breath again. She watched it change to wintry desolation till it grew empty of vessels, and was lonely as the Arctic Sea, and always it was grand and thought-inspiring. She went out one day in March when the home longing was upon her, and when it seemed that the city would be her death. She was tired of her food, tired of Mary, tired of her room. Her forehead was knotted tensely with pain of life and love. And she cried out with a sudden joy, for she had never seen the lake more beautiful. Near the shore, a great mass of churned and heaving ice and snow lay like a robe of shaggy fur. Beyond this deep water spread a vivid pea green broken by wide irregular strips of dark purple. In the open water by the wall, A spatter of steel blue lay like the petals of some strange flower scattered upon the green. Great splendid clouds developed, marvelously like the clouds of June, making the girl's heart swell with memories of summer. They were white as wool, these mountainous clouds, and bottomed in violet, and as they passed the snowfields they sent down pink-purple misty shadows, which trailed away in splendor toward the green, which flamed in bewildering beauty beyond. The girl sat like one in a dream, while the wind blew the green and purple of the outer sea into a fantastic flitting forms, which dazzled her eyes like the stream of mingled banners. Each form seemed more beautiful than the preceding one. Each combination had such unearthly radiance. Her heart ached with exquisite sorrow to see it vanish. The girl felt that spring was coming on the wing of the southern wind, and the desire to utter her passion grew almost into pain. It had other moods, this mighty spread of water. It could be angry, dangerous. Sometimes it rolled sullenly and convoluted in oily surges beneath its coverlid of snow, like a bed of monstrous serpents. Sometimes the leaden sky shut down over it, and from the desolate northeast a snowstorm rushed, hissing and howling. Sometimes it slumbered for days, quiet as a sleeping boa, then awoke and was a presence and a voice in the night, fit to make the hardiest tremble. Rose saw it when it was roused, but she had yet to see it in a frenzy. The knowledge of its worst came to her early in May, just before her return to the coulee. The day broke with the wind in the northeast. Rose, lying in her bed, could hear the roar of the lake. Never before had its voice penetrated so far. She sprang up and dressed, eager to see it in such a mood. Mary responded sleepily to her call, saying the lake would be there after breakfast. Rose did not regret her eagerness, though it was piercingly cold and raw. The sea was already terrific. Its spread of tawny yellow showed how it had reached down and laid hold on the sand of its bed. There were oily splotches of plum color scattered over it where the wind blew it smooth, and it reached to the wild east sky, cold, desolate, destructive. It had a fierce, breathing snarl, like a monster at meat. It leapt against the sea-wall like a rabid tiger, its sleek and spotted hide rolling. Every surge sent a triangular sheet of foam 25 feet above the wall, yellow and white shadowed with dull blue, and the wind caught it at its rose. And its crest burst into great clouds of spray, which sailed across the streets and dashed along the walk like rain, making the roadway like a river, while the main body of each uplifting wave, falling back astride the wall, crashed like the fall of glass, and the next wave met it with a growl of thunderous rage, striking it with concave palm, with a sound like a cannon's exploding roar. Out of the appalling obscurity to the north, frightened ships scudded at intervals, with bare masts bending like fire-trimmed pines. They hastened like the homing pigeons which do not look behind. The helmsmen stood grimly at their wheels, with eyes on the harbor ahead. The girl felt it all, as no one native to the sea can possibly do. It seemed as if the bounds of the flood had been overcome, and that it was about to hurl itself upon the land. The slender trees, standing deep in the swash of water, bowed like women in pain. The wall was half hidden, and the flood and the land seemed to mingle in battle. Rose walked along the shore, too much excited to go back to her breakfast. At noon she ate lunch hurriedly and returned to the shore. There were hundreds of people coming and going along the drive, young girls shrieking with glee as the sailing clouds of spray fell upon them. Rose felt angry to think they could be so silly in the face of such dreadful power. And she came upon Mason, dressed in a thick mackintosh coat, taking notes rapidly in a little book. He did not look up, and she passed him, wishing to speak, yet afraid to speak. Near him a young man was sketching. Mason stood like a rock in his long, close-fitting raincoat, while she was blown nearly off her feet by the blast. She came back against the wind, feeling her soul's internal storm rising. It seemed quite like a proposal of marriage to go up and speak to him, yet yet she could not forego the pleasure. He did not see her until she came into his lee, and then he smiled, extended his hand. She spoke first. "May I take shelter here?" His eyes lightened with a sudden, tender humor. "Free anchorage," he said, and drew her by the hand closer to his shoulder. It was a beautiful moment to her, and a dangerous one to him. He took refuge in outside matters. "How does that strike your inland eyes?" He pointed to the north. "It's awful. It's like the anger of God," she spoke into his bowed ear. "Please don't think I'm reporting it," he explained. "I'm only making a few notes about it for an editorial on the need of harbors." Each moment the fury increased, the waves deepened, the commotion sank down amid the sands of the deeper inshore water, and it boiled like milk. Splendid colors grew into it near at hand. The winds tore at the tops of the waves, and wove them into tawny banners, which blurred the air like blown sand. On the horizon the waves leaped in savage ranks, clutching at the sky like insane sea monsters, frantic and futile. "I've seen the Atlantic twice during a gale," shouted the artist to a companion, "but I never saw anything more awful than this. These waves are quicker and higher. I don't see how a vessel could live in it if caught broadside. It's the worst I ever saw here." "I'm going down to the south side. Would you like to go?" Mason asked of Rose. "I would indeed," she replied. Back from the lake shore the wind was less powerful, but more uncertain. It came in gusts which nearly upturned the streetcars. Men and women scudded from shelter to shelter like beleaguered citizens avoiding cannon shots. "What makes our lake so terrible," said Mason in the car, "is the fact that it has a smooth shore, no indentations, no harbors. There's only one harbor here in Chicago, behind the breakwater, and every vessel in mid-lake must come here. Those flying ships are seeking safety here like birds. The harbor will be full of disabled vessels." As they left the car, a roaring gust swept round a 20-story building with such power that Rose would have been taken off her feet had not Mason put his arms around her shoulders. "You're at a disadvantage," he said, "with skirts." He knew she prided herself on her strength, and he took no credit to himself for standing where she fell. It was precisely as if they were alone together. The storm seemed to wall them in, and his manner was more intimate than ever before. It was in very truth the first time they had been out together, and also it was the only time he had assumed any physical care for her. He had never asserted his greater muscular power and mastery of material things, and she was amazed to see that his lethargy was only a mood. He could be alert and agile at need. It made his cynicism appear to be a mood also. At least, it made her heart wondrously light to think so. They came upon the lake shore again, near the auditorium. The refuge behind the breakwater was full of boats, straining at anchor, rolling, pitching, crashing together. Close about the edge of the breakwater, ships were rounding hurriedly, and 2 broken vessels lay against the shore, threshing up and down in the awful grasp of the breakers. Far down, toward the south, the water dashed against the spiles, shooting 50 feet above the wall, sailing like smoke, deluging the street and lashing against the row of buildings across the way. Mason's keen eye took in the situation. "Every vessel that breaks anchor is doomed. Nothing can keep them from going on shore. Doubtless those 2 schooners lost anchor. That one there is dragging anchor," he said suddenly. "She's shifting position. And see that hulk." Rose for a moment could not see it. She lay flat on her side, a 2-master, her sails flapping and floating on the waves. Her anchor still held, but she had listed her cargo, careened, and so lay helpless. "There are men on it!" cried someone. "3 men! Don't you see them? The water goes over them every time." "Sure enough. I wonder if they're going to let them drown here in the harbor." Rose grew numb with horror. On the rounded side of the floating hulk, 3 men were clinging, looking like pegs of tops. They could only be seen at intervals, for the water broke clear of their heads. It was only when one of them began to move to and fro that the mighty crowd became certainly aware of life still clinging to the hull. It was an awful thing to stand helplessly by and watch those brave men battle, but no lifeboat or tug could live out there. In the station, men wept and imprecated at their despair. Twice they tried to go out to the rescue of the beleaguered men, but could not reach them. Suddenly a flare of yellow spread out on the wave. A cry arose, "She's breaking up!" Rose seized Mason's arm in a frenzy of horror. "Oh, God, can't someone help them?" "They're out of reach," said Mason solemnly, and then the throng was silent. "Oh, they're building a raft," shouted a man with a glass, speaking at intervals for the information of all. "One man is tying a rope to the planks. He's helping the other men. Oh, he has his little raft nearly ready. They're crawling toward him." "Oh, see them!" exclaimed Rose. "Oh, the brave men! There, they are gone! Oh, the vessel is broken up!" On the wave nothing now lived but a yellow spread of lumber. The glass revealed no living thing. Mason turned to Rose with a grave and tender look. "You've just seen human beings engulfed like flies." No, there they are!" shouted 100 voices, as if in answer to Mason's thought. Thereafter the whole great city seemed to be watching those specks of human life, drifting toward almost certain death upon the breakwater of the south shore. For miles the beach was clustered black with people. They stood there, it seemed for hours, watching the slow approach of that tiny raft. Again and again the waves swept over it, and each time that indomitable man rose from the flood and was seen to pull his companions aboard. Other vessels drifted upon the rocks. Other steamers rolled heavily around the long breakwater. But nothing now distracted the gaze of the multitude from this appalling and amazing struggle against death. Nothing? No. Once and only once did the onlookers shift their intent gaze, and that was when a vessel passed the breakwater and went sailing toward the south through the fleet of anchored, straining, agonizing ships. At first no one paid attention to this latecomer, till Mason lifted his voice. "By heaven, that man is sailing!" It was true. Steady, swift, undeviating, the vessel headed through the fleet. She did not drift, nor wander, nor hesitate. She sailed as if the helmsman, with set teeth, were saying, "By God, if I must die on the rocks, I'll go to my death, the captain of my vessel." And so, with wheel in his hand and epic oaths in his mouth, he sailed directly into the long row of spiles, over which the waves ran like hellhounds, where a half-score of wrecks lay already churning into fragments in the awful tumult. The sailing vessel seemed not to waver, nor seek, nor dodge, seemed rather to choose the most deadly battle-place of waves and wall. "God, but that's magnificent of him," Mason said to himself. Rose held her breath, her face white and set with horror. "Oh, must he die?" "There is no hope for him. She will strike in a moment. She strikes. She is gone." The vessel entered the gray confusion of the breakers and struck the piles like a battering ram. The waves buried her from sight. Then the recoil flung her back. For the first time she swung broadside to the storm. The work of the helmsman was over. She reeled, resisted an instant, and then submitted to her fate, crumbled against the pitiless wall like paper, and thereafter was lost to sight. Now this dramatic and terrible scene had held the attention of the onlookers. Once more they searched for the tiny raft. It was nearing the lake wall at another furious point of contact. An innumerable crowd spread like a black robe over the shore, waiting to see the tiny float strike. A hush fell over every voice. Each soul was solemn, as if facing the maker of the world. Out on the point, just where the doomed sailors seemed like to strike, there was a little commotion. A tiny figure was seen perched on one of the spiles. Each wave, as it towered above him, seemed ready to sweep him away, but each time he bowed his head and seemed to sweep through the gray wall. He was a Negro, and he held a rope in his hands. As they comprehended the danger, the crowd cheered him, but in the thunder of the surf no human voice could avail. The bold Negro could not cry out. He could only motion, but the brave man on the raft saw his purpose. He was alone with the shipwrecked ones. In they came, lifted and hurled by a prodigious swell. They struck the wall just beneath the Negro and disappeared beneath the waves. All seemed over, and some of the spectators fell weeping. Others turned away, and suddenly the indomitable commander of the raft rose, then his companions, and then it was perceived that he had bound them all to the raft. The Negro flung his rope, and one man caught at it, but it was swept out of reach on a backward-leaping billow. Again they came in, their white, strained, set faces and wild eyes turned to the intrepid rescuer. Again they struck, and this time the Negro caught and held one of the sailors, held him while the foam fell away and the succeeding waves swept him over the spiles to safety. Again the resolute man flung his noose and caught the second sailor, whose rope was cut by the leader, the captain, who was the last to be saved. As the Negro came back, dragging his third man over the wall, a mighty cry went up, a strange, faint, multitudinous cry, and the Negro was swallowed up by the multitude. Mason turned to Rose and spoke. Sometimes men seem to be worthwhile. End of section 34.
Section 35 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Natalie Contino. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 15, by Various. Elizabeth Stevenson Gaskell, 1810 to 1865. Critics agree in placing the novels of Mrs. Gaskell on a level with the works of Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte. It is more than probable that future generations will turn to her stories for correct pictures of simple everyday life that must fade in the swift succession of years. She has been compared to a naturalist who knows intimately the flora and fauna of his native heath. Elizabeth Cleghorn Stevenson was born in Chelsea, England, September 29, 1810, the daughter of William Stevenson, a literary man who was keeper of the records of the Treasury. She lived with her aunt at Knutsford in Cheshire, was sent to a private school in Stratford-on-Avon, and visited London and Edinburgh, where her beauty was much admired. In 1832 she was married to the Reverend William Gaskell, minister of a Unitarian chapel in Manchester. Mrs. Gaskell did not begin to write until she had reached middle age, and then chiefly to distract her thoughts after the death of their only son in 1844. Her first book, Mary Barton, published anonymously in 1848, achieved extraordinary success. This was a novel with a purpose, for Mrs. Gaskell believed that the hostility between employers and employed, which constantly disturbed the manufacturing beehive of Manchester, was caused by mutual ignorance. She therefore set herself the task of depicting faithfully the lives of the people around her. It must be remembered, too, that the social types chosen by her were at that moment peculiarly interesting to a public weary of the novel of fashionable high life. The story provoked much public discussion, and among other critics, the social economist Mr. W. R. Gregg, in his essay on Mary Barton, published in 1849, took the part of the manufacturer. Mary Barton has been translated into French, German, and other languages, including Hungarian and Finnish. The story has for its central theme the gradual degeneration of John Barton, a workman who has a passionate hatred of the classes above him, and who, embittered by poverty and the death of his son and wife, joins the lawbreakers of the town, and finally murders Henry Corson, a master manufacturer. North and South, published in 1855, was written from the point of view of the masters, an admirable contrast to Barton being found in Thornton, the hero of this novel. In 1850, when Dickens was about to establish Household Words, he invited Mrs. Gaskell to contribute. This magazine contained her story, Lizzie Lay, and those immortal pictures of village life known as Cranford. Mrs. Gaskell's other novels are Ruth, the tragical story of a pretty young milliner's apprentice, Sylvia's Lovers, whose scene is Monkhaven, Whitby, at the end of the last century, Cousin Phyllis, a simple story of a farmer's daughter, which appeared first in the Cornhill magazine in 1863 till 1864, and Wives and Daughters, also contributed to the Cornhill, and left unfinished by her death in Manchester, November 12, 1865. By many persons, the last novel is considered her best work, owing to its strength of characterization. Molly Gibson, the heroine, Cynthia, a heartless coquette, Squire Hamley and his sons Roger and Osborne of Hamley Hall, and the Earl of Cumnor and his family at the Towers, all are treated with impartial skill. Her famous Life of Charlotte Bronte appeared in 1857. She became acquainted with Miss Bronte in 1850, and they were friends at once. A collected edition of Mrs. Gaskell's works, published in 7 volumes in 1873, includes the short stories The Grey Woman, Morton Hall, Mr. Harrison's Confessions, A Dark Night's Work, The Moorland Cottage, Round the Sofa, The Old Nurse's Story, The Well of Penmorpha, The Sexton's Hero, Lois the Witch, and others. Cranford is identified as the town of Knutsford. Its population consists of widows and maiden ladies in bonds to their ancient gentility. With deft touch, Mrs. Gaskell brings out the humor and pathos of these quaint characters, her finest creation being Miss Mattie Jenkins. Our Society, from Cranford. In the first place, Cranford is in possession of the Amazons. All the holders of houses above a certain rent are women. If a married couple come to settle in the town, somehow the gentleman disappears. He is either fairly frightened to death by being the only man in the Cranford evening parties, or he is accounted for by being with his regiment, his ship, or closely engaged in business all the week in the great neighboring commercial town of Drumble, distant only 20 miles on a railroad. In short, whatever does become of the gentlemen, they are not at Cranford. What could they do if they were there? The surgeon has his round of 30 miles and sleeps at Cranford. But every man cannot be a surgeon. For keeping the trim gardens full of choice flowers without a weed to speck them, for frightening away little boys who look wistfully at the said flowers through the railings, for rushing out at the geese that occasionally venture into the gardens if the gates are left open, for deciding all questions of literature and politics without troubling themselves with unnecessary reasons or arguments, for obtaining clear and correct knowledge of everybody's affairs in the parish, for keeping their neat maidservants in admirable order, for kindness somewhat dictatorial to the poor, and real tender good offices to each other whenever they are in distress, the ladies of Cranford are quite sufficient. A man, as one of them observed to me once, is so in the way in the house. Although the ladies of Cranford know all each other's proceedings, they are exceedingly indifferent to each other's opinions. Indeed, as each has her own individuality, not to say eccentricity, pretty strongly developed, nothing is so easy as verbal retaliation. But somehow goodwill reigns among them to a considerable degree. The Cranford ladies have only an occasional little quarrel, spurted out in a few peppery words and angry jerks of the heads. just enough to prevent the even tenor of their lives from becoming too flat. Their dress is very independent of fashion. As they observe, "What does it signify how we dress here at Cranford, where everybody knows us?" And if they go from home, their reason is equally cogent. "What does it signify how we dress here, where nobody knows us?" The materials of their clothes are in general good and plain, and most of them are nearly as scrupulous as Miss Tyler of cleanly memory. But I will answer for it, the last gigot, the last tight and scanty petticoat in wear in England, was seen in Cranford, and seen without a smile. I can testify to a magnificent family red silk umbrella under which a gentle little spinster, left alone of many brothers and sisters, used to patter to church on rainy days. Have you any red silk umbrellas in London? We had a tradition of the first that had ever been seen in Cranford, and the little boys mobbed it and called it a stick and petticoats. It might have been the very red silk one I have described, held by a strong father over a troop of little ones. The poor little lady, the survivor of all, could scarcely carry it. Then there were rules and regulations for visiting and calls, and they were announced to any young people who might be staying in the town, with all the solemnity with which the old Manx laws were read once a year on the tin-walled mount. "Our friends have sent to inquire how you are after your journey tonight, my dear." 15 miles in a gentleman's carriage. "They will give you some rest tomorrow, but the next day I've no doubt they will call, so be at liberty after 12. From 12 to 3 are our calling hours." Then, after they had called, "It is the 3rd day. I dare say your mamma has told you, my dear, never to let more than 3 days elapse between receiving a call and returning it, and also that you are never to stay longer than a quarter of an hour." "But am I to look at my watch? How am I to find out when a quarter of an hour has passed?" "You must keep thinking about the time, my dear, and not allow yourself to forget it in conversation." As everybody had this rule in their minds, whether they received or paid a call, of course no absorbing subject was ever spoken about. We kept ourselves to short sentences of small talk, and were punctual to our time. I imagine that a few of the gentlefolks of Cranford were poor, and had some difficulty in making both ends meet. But they were like the Spartans, and concealed their smart under a smiling face. We none of us spoke of money, because that subject savored of commerce and trade, and though some might be poor, we were all aristocratic. Cranfordians had that kindly esprit de corps which made them overlook all deficiencies in success when some among them tried to conceal their poverty. When Mrs. Forrester, for instance, gave a party in her baby house of a dwelling, and the little maiden disturbed the ladies on the sofa by a request that she might get the tea-tray out from underneath, everyone took this novel proceeding as the most natural thing in the world, and talked on about household forms and ceremonies as if we all believed that our hostess had a regular servants' hall, second table, with housekeeper and steward, instead of the one little charity school maiden, whose short, ruddy arms could never have been strong enough to carry the tray upstairs if she had not been assisted in private by her mistress, who now sat in state, pretending not to know what cakes were sent up, though she knew, and we knew, and she knew that we knew, and we knew that she knew that we knew. She had been busy all the morning making tea bread and sponge cakes. There were 1 or 2 consequences arising from this general but unacknowledged poverty, and this very much acknowledged gentility, which were not amiss, and which might be introduced into many circles of society to their great improvement. For instance, the inhabitants of Cranford kept early hours, and clattered home in their pattens under the guidance of a lantern-bearer about 9 o'clock at night, and the whole town was abed and asleep by 10:30. Moreover, it was considered vulgar, a tremendous word in Cranford, to give anything expensive in the way of eatable or drinkable at the evening entertainments. Wafer bread and butter and sponge biscuits were all that the Honorable Mrs. Jameson gave, and she was sister-in-law to the late Earl of Glenmire, although she did practice such elegant economy. Elegant economy! How naturally one falls back into the phraseology of Cranford. There, economy was always elegant, and money spending always vulgar and ostentatious, a sort of sour grapeism which made us very peaceful and satisfied. I never shall forget the dismay felt when a certain Captain Brown came to live at Cranford, and openly spoke about his being poor, not in a whisper to an intimate friend, the doors and windows being previously closed, but in the public street, in a loud military voice, alleging his poverty as a reason for not taking a particular house. The ladies of Cranford were already rather moaning over the invasion of their territories by a man and a gentleman. He was a half-pay captain, and had obtained some situation on a neighboring railroad, which had been vehemently petitioned against by the little town. And if, in addition to his masculine gender and his connection with the obnoxious railroad, he was so brazen as to talk of being poor, why then indeed he must be sent to Coventry. Death was as true and as common as poverty, yet people never spoke about that loud out in the streets. It was a word not to be mentioned to ears polite. We had tacitly agreed to ignore that any with whom we associated on terms of visiting equality could ever be prevented by poverty from doing anything that they wished. If we walked to or from a party, it was because the night was so fine, or the air so refreshing, not because sedan chairs were expensive. If we wore prints instead of summer silks, it was because we preferred a washing material, and so on, till we blinded ourselves to the vulgar fact that we were all of us people of very moderate means. Of course, then, we did not know what to make of a man who could speak of poverty as if it was not a disgrace. Yet somehow Captain Brown made himself respected in Cranford, and was called upon in spite of all resolutions to the contrary. I was surprised to hear his opinions quoted as authority at a visit which I paid to Cranford about a year after he had settled in the town. My own friends had been among the bitterest opponents of any proposal to visit the captain and his daughters only 12 months before, and now he was even admitted in the tabooed hours before 12. True, it was to discover the cause of a smoking chimney before the fire was lighted, but still Captain Brown walked upstairs, nothing daunted, spoke in a voice too large for the room, and joked quite in the way of a tame man about the house. He had been blind to all the small slights and omissions of trivial ceremonies with which he had been received. He had been friendly, though the Cranford ladies had been cool. He had answered small, sarcastic compliments in good faith, and, with his manly frankness, had overpowered all the shrinking which met him as a man who was not ashamed to be poor. And at last his excellent masculine common sense, and his facility in devising expedients to overcome domestic dilemmas, had gained him an extraordinary place as authority among the Cranford ladies. He himself went on in his course as unaware of his popularity as he had been of the reverse. I wondered what the Cranford ladies did with Captain Brown at their parties. We had often rejoiced in former days that there was no gentleman to be attended to and to find conversation for at the card parties. We had congratulated ourselves upon the snugness of the evenings, and in our love for gentility and distaste of mankind, we had almost persuaded ourselves that to be a man was to be vulgar, so that when I found my friend and hostess Miss Jenkins was going to have a party in my honor, and that Captain and the Miss Browns were invited, I wondered much what would be the course of the evening. Card tables with green baize tops were set out by daylight, just as usual. It was the 3rd week in November, so the evenings closed in about 4. Candles and clean packs of cards were arranged on each table. The fire was made up, the neat maidservant had received her last directions, and there we stood, dressed in our best, each with a candle lighter in our hands, ready to dart at the candles as soon as the first knock came. Parties in Cranford were solemn festivities, making the ladies feel gravely elated as they sat together in their best dresses. As soon as 3 had arrived, we sat down to preference, I being the unlucky 4th. The next 4 comers were put down immediately to another table, and presently the tea trays, which I had seen set out in the storeroom as I passed in the morning, were placed each on the middle of a card table. The china was delicate eggshell, the old-fashioned silver glittered with polishing, but the eatables were of the slightest description. While the trays were yet on the tables, Captain and the Miss Browns came in, and I could see that, somehow or other, the Captain was a favorite with all the ladies present. Ruffled brows were smoothed, sharp voices lowered at his approach. Miss Brown looked ill and depressed almost to gloom. Miss Jessie smiled as usual, and seemed nearly as popular as her father. He immediately and quietly assumed the man's place in the room, attended to everyone's wants, lessened the pretty maid servant's labor by waiting on empty cups and bread and butterless ladies, and yet did it all in so easy and dignified a manner, and so much as if it were a matter of course for the strong to attend to the weak, that he was a true man throughout. He played for 3-penny points with as grave an interest as if they had been pounds, and yet in all his attention to strangers he had an eye on his suffering daughter, for suffering I was sure she was, though to many eyes she might only appear to be irritable. Miss Jessie could not play cards, but she talked to the sitters out, who before her coming had been rather inclined to be cross. She sang, too, to an old cracked piano, which I think had been a spinet in its youth. Miss Jessie sang Jock o' Hazeldean a little out of tune, but we were none of us musical, though Miss Jenkins beat time out of time by way of appearing to be so. It was very good of Miss Jenkins to do this, for I had seen that, a little before, she had been a good deal annoyed by Miss Jessie Brown's unguarded admission, apropos of Shetland wool, that she had an uncle, her mother's brother, who was a shopkeeper in Edinburgh. Miss Jenkins tried to drown this confession by a terrible cough, for the Honourable Mrs. Jamieson was sitting at the card table nearest Miss Jessie, and what would she say or think if she found out that she was in the same room with a shopkeeper's niece? But Miss Jessie Brown, who had no tact, as we all agreed the next morning, would repeat the information, and assure Miss Pole she could easily get her the identical Shetland wool required, through my uncle, who has the best assortment of Shetland goods of anyone in Edinburgh. It was to take the taste of this out of our mouths, and the sound of this out of our ears, that Miss Jenkins proposed music. So I say again, it was very good of her to beat time to the song. When the trays reappeared with biscuits and wine, punctually at 8:45, there was conversation, comparing of cards, and talking over tricks. But by and by, Captain Brown sported a bit of literature. "Have you seen any numbers of the Pickwick papers?" said he. They were then publishing in parts. "Capital thing!" Now, Miss Jenkins was daughter of a deceased rector of Cranford, and on the strength of a number of manuscript sermons and a pretty good library of divinity, considered herself literary, and looked upon any conversation about books as a challenge to her. So she answered and said, yes, she had seen them. Indeed, she might say she had read them. "And what did you think of them?" exclaimed Captain Brown. "Aren't they famously good?" So urged, Miss Jenkins could not but speak. "I must say I don't think they are by any means equal to Dr. Johnson. Still, perhaps the author is young. Let him persevere, and who knows what he may become if he will take the great doctor for his model." This was evidently too much for Captain Brown to take placidly, and I saw the words on the tip of his tongue before Miss Jenkins had finished her sentence. "It is quite a different sort of thing, my dear madam," he began. "I am quite aware of that," returned she, "and I make allowances, Captain Brown." "Just allow me to read you a scene out of this month's number," pleaded he. "I had it only this morning, and I don't think the company can have read it yet." "As you please," said she, settling herself with an air of resignation. He read the account of the sweary which Sam Weller gave at Bath. Some of us laughed heartily. I did not dare because I was staying in the house. Miss Jenkins sat in patient gravity. When it was ended, she turned to me and said with mild dignity, "Fetch me Rasselas, my dear, out of the book-room." When I brought it to her, she turned to Captain Brown. "Now allow me to read you a scene, and then the present company can judge between your favorite Mr. Boz and Dr. Johnson." She read one of the conversations between Rasselas and Imlac in a high-pitched, majestic voice, and when she had ended she said, "I imagine I am now justified in my preference of Dr. Johnson as a writer of fiction." The captain screwed his lips up and drummed on the table, but he did not speak. She thought she would give a finishing blow or two. "I consider it vulgar and below the dignity of literature to publish in numbers." "How was the Rambler published, ma'am?" asked Captain Brown in a low voice, which I think Miss Jenkins could not have heard. "Dr. Johnson's style is a model for young beginners. My father recommended it to me when I began to write letters. I have formed my own style upon it. I recommend it to your favorite." "I should be very sorry for him to exchange his style for any such pompous writing," said Captain Brown. Miss Jenkins felt this as a personal affront, in a way of which the captain had not dreamed. Epistolary writing she and her friends considered as her forte. Many a copy of many a letter have I seen written and corrected on the slate, before she seized the half-hour just previous to post-time to assure her friends of this or that, and Dr. Johnson was, as she said, her model in these compositions. She drew herself up with dignity and only replied to Captain Brown's last remark by saying, with marked emphasis on every syllable, "I prefer Dr. Johnson to Mr. Boz." It is said, I won't vouch for the fact, that Captain Brown was heard to say, sotto voce, "Down, Dr. Johnson." If he had, he was penitent afterwards, as he showed by going to stand near Miss Jenkins' armchair, and endeavoring to beguile her into conversation on some more pleasing subject. But she was inexorable. End of section 35.
Section 36 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 15 by Various. Selected works by Théophile Gautier, 1811 to 1872, by Robert Sanderson. Théophile Gautier was born in Tarbes, department of the Hautes-Pyrénées, in southern France, August 31st, 1811. Like all French boys, he was sent to the Lycée Academy, where he promised to be a brilliant scholar, but his father was really his tutor, and to him Gautier attributed his instruction. Young Théophile showed marked preference for the so-called authors of the Decadence, Claudianus, Martial, Petronius, and others, also for the old French writers, especially Villon and Rabelais, whom he says he knew by heart. This is significant in view of the young man's strong tendencies later on towards the new Romantic school. The artistic temperament was very strong in him, and while still carrying on his studies at college, he entered the painter Riault's studio. His introduction to Victor Hugo in 1830 may be considered the decisive point in Gautier's career. From that day, he gave up painting and became a fanatic admirer of the Romantic leader. A short time afterward, the first representation of Hermione took place, February 25, 1830, an important date in the life of Gautier. It was on this occasion that he put on for the only time that famous red waistcoat, which, with his long black mane streaming down his back, so horrified the staid Parisian bourgeois. This red waistcoat turns out, after all, not to have been a waistcoat at all, but a doublet, nor was it red, but pink. No truer is the legend, according to Gautier, that on this memorable occasion, armed with his two formidable fists, he felled right and left the terrified bourgeois. He says that he was at that time rather delicate, and had not yet developed that prodigious strength which later on enabled him to strike a 520-pound blow on a Turk's head. In appearance, Gautier was a large, corpulent man with a leonine countenance, swarthy complexion, long black hair falling over his shoulders, black beard, and brilliant black eyes. An Oriental in looks as well as in some of his tastes. He had a passion for cats. His house was overrun by them, and he seldom wrote without having one on his lap. The privations he underwent during the siege of Paris, doubly hard to a man of Gautier's gargantuesque appetite, no doubt hastened his death. He died on October 23, 1872, of hypertrophy of the heart. Gautier is one of those writers of whom one may say a vast deal of good and a vast deal of harm. His admirers think that justice has not been done him, that his fame will go on rising and his name will live as one of the great writers of France. Others think that his name may perhaps not entirely disappear, but that if he is remembered at all, it will be solely as the author of Emo et Camé, Enamels and Cameos. He wrote in his youth a book that did him great harm in the eyes of the public, but he has written something else besides Mademoiselle du Maupin, and both in prose and poetry we shall find a good deal to admire in him. One thing is certain, he is a marvelous stylist. In his earliest poems, Gautier already possesses that admirable artistic skill that prompts him to choose his words as a painter his colors, or a jeweler his gems and stones, so as to produce the most brilliant effects. These first compositions also have a grace, a charm, that we shall find lacking later on, for as he proceeds with his work, he pays more and more attention to form and finish. Albertus, or Soul and Sin, the closing poem of Gautier's first collection, is a semi-diabolic, semi-fashionable legend. An old witch, Veronica, a second, Meg Marilis, transforms herself into a beautiful maiden and makes love to Albertus, a young artist, otherwise Gautier himself. He cares for nothing but his art, but falls a victim to the spell cast over him by the siren. At the stroke of midnight, Veronica, to the young man's horror, from a beautiful woman changes back to the old hag she was, and carries him off to a place where witches, sorcerers, hobgoblins, harpies, ghouls, and other frightful creatures are holding a monstrous saturnalia, at the end of which Albertus is left for dead in a ditch of the Appian Way with broken back and twisted neck. What does it all mean, the reader may ask? That the wages of sin is death seems to be the moral contained in this poem, if indeed any moral is intended at all. Be that as it may, Albertus is a literary gem in its way, a work in which the poet has given free scope to his brilliant imagination, and showered by the handful the gems and jewels in his literary casket. Gautier may be said to have possessed the poetry of death. Some would say its horrors. This sentiment of horror at the repulsive manner of man's total destruction finds most vivid expression in The Comedy of Death, a fantastic poem divided into two parts, Death in Life and Life in Death. The dialogue between the bride and the earthworm is of a flesh-creeping nature. It is, however, as the poet of Emo et Camés, Enamels and Cameos, that Théophile Gautier will be chiefly remembered. Every poem but one in this collection is written in short, octosyllabic verse, and every one is what the title implies. A precious stone, a chiseled gem. Gautier's wonderful and admirable talent for grouping together certain words that produce on one's eye and mind the effect of a beautiful picture. His intense love of art, of the outline, the plastic, appear throughout this work. You realize on reading Aimons et Camées, more perhaps than in any other work by this writer, that the poet is fully conscious of his powers and knows just how to use them. Any poem may be selected at random and will be found a work of art. The same qualities that distinguish Gautier as a poet are to be found in his novels, narratives of travels, criticisms. In short, in everything he wrote. Intense love for the beautiful, physically beautiful, wonderful talent for describing it. Of his novels, properly speaking, there are 4 that stand out prominently, each very different in its subject, a proof of Gautier's great versatility, all perfect in their execution. The first is Mademoiselle du Maupin. It is an immoral book, but it is a beautiful book, not only because written with a rare elegance of style, but also because it makes you love beauty. Briefly, Mademoiselle du Maupin may be called a paean to beauty, sung by its high priest, Théophile Gautier. The other remarkable novels by this writer are Le Capitaine Fracasse, Captain Smashall, Le Roman de la Momie, The Romance of the Mummy, and Spirite. Captain Fracasse, although not published until 1863, had been announced long beforehand, and Gautier had worked at it, off and on, for 20 years. It belongs to that class of novel known as picaresque, romances of adventures and battles. Captain Fracasse is certainly the most popular of Gautier's works. The Romance of the Mummy is a very remarkable book, in which science and fiction have been blended in the most artistic and clever manner, picturesque, like all of Gautier's writings, but the work of a savant as well as of a novelist. Here, more than in any other book by this author, with the exception perhaps of Aria Marcella, Gautier has revived in a most lifelike way an entire civilization so long extinct. The Romance of the Mummy abounds in beautiful descriptions. The description of the finding of the mummy, that of the royal tombs, of Thebes with its 100 gates, the triumphal entrance of Pharaoh into that city, the crossing of the Red Sea by the Israelites, are all marvelous pictures that not only filled the reader with the same admiration he would evince at the sight of a painting by one of the great masters, but give him the illusion of witnessing in the body the scene so admirably described. Spirite, a fantastic story, is a source of surprise to readers familiar with Gautier's other works. They find it hard to conceive that so thorough a materialist as Gautier could ever have produced a work so spiritualistic in its nature. The clever handling of a mystic subject, the richness and coloring of the descriptions, together with the certain ideal and poetical vein that runs through the book, make of Spirite one of Gautier's most remarkable works. Théophile Gautier has also written a number of novelles, or short novels, and tales, some of which are striking compositions. Aria Marcella is one of these, a brilliant, masterly composition in which Gautier gives us such a perfect illusion of the past. Under his magic pen, we find ourselves walking the streets of Pompeii and living over the life of the Romans in the 1st century of our era. And Un Nid de Cleopatra, A Night with Cleopatra, is a vivid resurrection of the brilliant Egyptian court. Of his various journeys to Spain, Italy, and the Orient, Gautier has given us the most captivating relations. To many, this is not the least interesting portion of Gautier's work. the same qualities that are so striking in his poems and novels: vividness of description, love of the picturesque, wonderful power of expression, are likewise apparent in his relations of travels. As a literary and especially as an art critic, Gautier ranks high, bringing to this branch of literature the same qualities that distinguish him in others. He created a descriptive and picturesque method of criticism peculiarly his own. Of his innumerable articles on art and literature, some have been collected under the names of Les Grotesques, a series of essays on a number of poets at the end of the 16th and first half of the 17th centuries, ridiculed by Boileau, but in whom Gautier finds some wheat among the chaff. The history of dramatic art in France for the last 25 years, beginning with the year 1837, will be consulted with great profit by those who are curious to follow the dramatic movement in that country. Of his essays on art, one is as excellent as the other. All the great masters are treated with a loving and admiring hand. Among the miscellaneous works of this prolific writer should be mentioned Menagerie Intime, Home Menagerie, in which the author makes us acquainted in a most charming and familiar way with his home life, and the various pets, cats, dogs, white rats, parrots, etc., that in turn shared his house with him. La nature chez elle, Nature at Home, that none but a close observer of nature could have written. The last book written by Gautier before his death was Tableaux de Siège, Siege Pictures, 1871. The subjects are treated just in the way we might expect from such a writer, from a purely artistic point of view. Gautier has written for the stage only short plays and ballets, but if all he ever wrote were published, his works would fill nearly 300 volumes. In spite of the quantity and quality of his books, the French Academy did not open her doors to him, but no more did it to Molière, Beaumarchais, Balzac, and many others. Opinions still vary greatly as to Théophile Gautier's literary merits, but his brilliant descriptive powers, his eminent qualities as a stylist, together with the influence he exercised over contemporary letters as the introducer of the plastic in literature, would seem sufficient to rank him among the great writers of France. The entry of Pharaoh into Thebes, from The Romance of a Mummy. At length their chariot reached the maneuvering ground, an immense enclosure, carefully leveled, used for splendid military displays. Terraces, one above the other, which must have employed for years the 30 nations led away into slavery, formed a frame en relief for the gigantic parallelogram. Sloping walls built of crude bricks lined these terraces. Their tops were covered, several rows deep, by hundreds of thousands of Egyptians, whose white or brightly colored costumes blazed in the sun with that perpetually restless movement which characterizes a multitude, even when it appears motionless. Behind this line of spectators, the cars, chariots, and litters, with their drivers, grooms, and slaves, looked like the encampment of an emigrating nation. Such was their immense number. For Thebes, the marvel of the ancient world, counted more inhabitants than did some kingdoms. The fine, even sand of the vast arena, bordered with 1,000,000 heads, gleamed like mica dust beneath the light, falling from a sky as blue as the enamel on the statuettes of Osiris. On the south side of the field, the terraces were broken, making way for a road which stretched towards Upper Ethiopia, the whole length of the Libyan chain. In the corresponding corner, the opening in the massive brick walls prolonged the roads to the Ramses Miamon Palace. A frightful uproar, rumbling deep and mighty as that of an approaching sea, arose in the distance and drowned the thousand murmurs of the crowd. like the roar of the lion which hushes the barking of the jackals. Soon the noise of instruments of music could be distinguished amidst this terrestrial thunder, produced by the chariot wheels and the rhythmic pace of the foot soldiers. A sort of reddish cloud, like that raised by the desert blast, filled the sky in that direction, yet the wind had gone down. There was not a breath of air, and the smallest branches of the palm trees hung motionless, as if they had been carved on a granite capital. Not a hair moved on the women's moist foreheads, and the fluted streamers of their headdresses hung loosely down their backs. This powdery fog was caused by the marching army and hung over it like a fallow cloud. The tumult increases. The whirlwinds of dust opened, and the first files of musicians entered the immense arena, to the great satisfaction of the multitude, who, in spite of its respect for His Majesty, were beginning to tire of waiting beneath the sun, which would have melted any other skulls than those of the Egyptians. The advance guard of musicians halted for several instants. Colleges of priests, deputations of the principal inhabitants of Thebes, crossed the maneuvering ground to meet the pharaoh, and arranged themselves in a row in postures of the most profound respect, in such manner as to give free passage to the procession. The band, which alone was a small army, consisted of drums, tabors, trumpets, and sistras. The first squad passed, blowing a deafening blast upon their short clarions of polished brass, which shone like gold. Each of these trumpeters carried a second horn under his arm, as if the instrument might grow weary sooner than the man. The costume of these men consisted of a short tunic fastened by a sash with ends falling in front. A small band, in which were stuck 2 ostrich feathers, hanging over either side, bound their thick hair. These plumes, so worn, recalled to mind the antennae of scarabaei, and gave the wearers an odd look of being insects. The drummers, clothed in a simple gathered skirt and naked to the waist, beat the onographic skinheads of their rounded drums with sycamore wood drumsticks, their instruments suspended by leathern shoulder belts, and observed the time which a drum major marked for them by repeatedly turning towards them and clapping his hands. After the drummers came the sisters players, who shook their instruments by a quick, abrupt motion, and made, at measured intervals, the metal links ring on the 4 bronze bars. The tabor players carried their oblong instruments crosswise, held up by a scarf passed around the neck, and struck the lightly stretched parchment with both hands. Each company of musicians numbered at least 200 men, but the hurricane of noise produced by trumpets, drums, tabors, and sistras, and which would have drawn blood from the ears inside a palace, was none too loud or too unbearable beneath the vast cupola of heaven. In the midst of this immense open space, amongst the buzzing crowd, at the head of this army which would baffle nomenclators, and which was now advancing with a roar as of great waters. And was it too much to have 800 musicians preceding a pharaoh who was the best loved of Amun-Ra, represented by colossal statues of basalt and granite 60 cubits high, whose name was written in cartouches on imperishable monuments, and his history painted and sculptured and painted on the walls of the hypostyle chambers, on the sides of pylons, in interminable bas-relief, in frescoes without end? Was it indeed too much for a king who could raise 100 conquered races by the hair of their heads, and from his high throne corrected the nations with his whip, for a living sun burning their dazzled eyes, for a god almost eternal? After the musicians came the barbarian captives, strangely formed with brutish faces, black skins, woolly hair, resembling apes as much as men, and dressed in the costume of their country, a short skirt about the hips, held by a single brace, embroidered in different colors. An ingenious and whimsical cruelty had suggested the way in which the prisoners were chained. Some were bound with their elbows drawn behind their backs, others with their hands lifted above their heads, in a still more painful position. One had his wrists fastened in wooden cangs, instruments of torture still used in China. Another was half strangled in a sort of pillory, or a chain of them were linked together by the same rope, each victim having a knot round his neck. It seemed as if those who had bound these unfortunates had found a pleasure in forcing them into unnatural positions, and they advanced before their conqueror with awkward and tottering gait, rolling their large eyes and contorted with pain. Guards walked beside them, regulating their step by beating them with staves. Tawny women, with long flowing hair, carrying their children in ragged strips of cloth bound about their foreheads, came behind them, bent, covered with shame, exhibiting their naked squalor and deformity. A wretched company, devoted to the most degrading uses. Others, young and beautiful, with lighter skin, their arms encircled by broad ivory bracelets, their ears pulled down by large metal discs, were enveloped in long tunics with wide sleeves, an embroidered hem around the neck, and falling in small flat folds to their ankles, upon which anklets rattled. Poor girls, torn from country, family, perhaps lovers, smiling through their tears. For the power of beauty is boundless. Strangeness gives rise to caprice, and perhaps the royal favor awaited one of these barbarian captives in the depths of the gymnasium. They were accompanied by soldiers who kept away the crowd. The standard-bearers came next, lifting high the gilded staves of their flags, representing mystic berries, sacred hawks, heads of Hathor crowned with ostrich plumes, winged ibexes, inscriptions embellished with the king's name, crocodiles, and other religious or warlike emblems. Long white streamers, spotted with black, were tied to these standards and floated gracefully with every motion. At sight of the standards announcing the appearance of Pharaoh, the deputations of priests and notables raised toward him with their supplicating hands, or let them hang, palm outwards against their knees. Some even prostrated themselves, with elbows pressed to their sides, their faces in the dust, in attitudes of absolute submission and profound adoration. The spectators waved their large palm leaves in every direction. A herald or reader, holding in one hand a roll covered with hieroglyphics, came forward quite alone between the standard-bearers and the incense-bearers who preceded the king's litter. He proclaimed in a loud voice, resounding as a brass trumpet, the victories of the Pharaoh. He recounted the results of the different battles, the number of captives and war chariots taken from the enemy, the amount of plunder, the measures of gold dust, and the elephants' tusks, the ostrich feathers, the masses of fragrant gum, the giraffes, lions, panthers, and other rare animals. He mentioned the names of the barbarian chiefs killed by the javelins or the arrows of His Majesty. Arois, the all-powerful, the loved of the gods. At each announcement, the people sent up an immense cry, and from the top of the slopes strewed the conquerors' paths with long green palm branches they held in their hands. At last the Pharaoh appeared. Priests, turning towards him at regular intervals, stretched out their amphoras to him, first throwing incense on the coals blazing in the little bronze cup, holding them by a handle formed like a scepter, with the head of some sacred animal at the other end. They walked backwards respectfully, while the fragrant blue smoke ascended to the nostrils of the triumpher, apparently as indifferent to these honors as a divinity of bronze or basalt. 12 Ares, or military chiefs, their heads covered by a light helmet, surrounded by ostrich feathers, naked to the waist, their loins enveloped in a narrow skirt with stiff folds, their targets suspended from the front of their belts. supported a sort of huge shield on which rested the pharaoh's throne. It was a chair with arms and legs in the form of a lion, high-backed, with large full cushion, adorned on the sides with a kind of trellis work of pink and blue flowers. The arms, legs, moldings of the seat were gilded, and the parts which were not flamed with bright colors. On either side of the litter, 4 fan-bearers waved enormous semicircular fans, fixed to gilded staves. 2 priests held aloft a large, richly decorated horn of plenty, from which fell bunches of enormous lotus blooms. The pharaoh wore a mitre-like helmet, cut out to make room for the ear, and brought down over the back of the neck to protect it. On the blue ground of the helmet scintillated a quantity of dots like the eyes of birds, made of 3 circles, black, white, and red. A scarlet and yellow border ran along the edge, and the symbolic viper, twisting its golden coils at the back, stood erect above the royal forehead. 2 long curled feathers, purple in color, floated over his shoulders and completed his majestically elegant headdress. A wide gorget, with 7 rows of enamels, precious stones, and golden beads, fell over the pharaoh's chest and gleamed brightly in the sunlight. His upper garment was a sort of loose shirt with pink and black squares. The ends, lengthening into narrow slips, were wound several times about his bust and bound it closely. The sleeves, cut short near the shoulder and bordered with intersecting lines of gold, red, and blue, exposed his round, strong arms. The left furnished with a large metal wristband, meant to lessen the vibration of the string when he discharged an arrow from his triangular bow. And the right, ornamented by a bracelet in the form of a serpent in several coils, held a long gold scepter with a lotus bud at the end. The rest of his body was wrapped in drapery of the finest linen, minutely plaited, bound about the waist by a belt inlaid with small enamel and gold pleats. Between the band and the belt, his torso appeared, shining and polished like pink granite, shaped by a cunning workman. Sandals with returned toes, like skates, shod his long, narrow feet, placed together like those of the god on the temple walls. His smooth, beardless face with large, clearly cut features, which had seemed beyond any human power to disturb, and which the blood of common life did not color, with its death-like pallor, sealed lips, enormous eyes enlarged with black lines, the lids no more lowered than those of the sacred hawk, inspired by its very immobility a feeling of respectful fear. One might have thought that these fixed eyes were searching for eternity and the infinite. They never seemed to rest on surrounding objects. The satiety of pleasures, the surfeit of wishes satisfied as soon as expressed, the isolation of a demigod who has no equal among mortals, the disgust for perpetual adoration, and, as it were, the weariness of continual triumph, had forever frozen his face. Implacably gentle and of granite serenity, Osiris, judging the souls, could not have had a more majestic and calm expression. A large tame lion, lying by his side, stretched out its enormous paws like a sphinx on its pedestal and blinked its yellow eyes. A rope, attached to the litter, bound the war chariots of the vanquished chiefs to the pharaoh. He dragged them behind him like animals in leash. These men, with fierce, despairing faces, their elbows drawn together by a strap and forming an ungraceful angle, tottered awkwardly at every motion of the chariots, driven by Egyptians. Next came the chariots of the young princes royal, drawn by thoroughbred horses, elegantly and nobly formed, with slender legs, sinewy hoofs, their manes cut short like a brush, harnessed by twos, tossing their red-plumed heads, with metal-bossed headstalls and frontlets. A curved pole, upheld on their withers, covered with scarlet panels, 2 collars surmounted by balls of polished brass, bound together by a light yoke bent like a bow with upturned ends. A belly band and breastband, elaborately stitched and embroidered, and rich housings with red or blue stripes and fringed with tassels, completed this strong, graceful, and light harness. The body of the chariot, painted red and white, ornamented with bronze plaques and half-spheres, something like the unbow of the shields, was flanked with two large quivers placed diagonally opposite each other, one filled with arrows and the other with javelins. On the front of each, a carved gilded lion, with set paws and muzzle wrinkled into a frightful grin, seemed ready to spring with a roar upon the enemy. The young princes had their hair bound with a narrow band in which the royal viper was twisted. Their only garment was a tunic gaudily embroidered at the neck and sleeves, and held in at the waist by a belt of black leather, clasped with a metal plate engraved with hieroglyphics. In this belt was a long dagger with triangular brass blade, the handle channeled crosswise, terminated by a hawk's head. In the chariot, by the side of each prince, stood the charioteer, who drove it in battle, and the groom, whose business it was to ward off with the shield the blows aimed at the combatant, while the latter discharged the arrows or threw the javelins, which he took from the quivers on either side of the car. In the wake of the princes followed the chariots, the Egyptian cavalry, 20,000 in number, each drawn by 2 horses and holding 3 men. They advanced 10 in a line, the axle trees perilously near together, but never coming in contact with each other, so great was the address of the drivers. Several lighter chariots, used for skirmishing and reconnoitering, marched at the head and carried 1 warrior only, who, in order to leave his hands free for fighting, wound the reins round his body. By bending to the right or the left or backwards, he guided or stopped his horses, and it was really wonderful to see the noble animals, apparently left to themselves, but governed by imperceptible movements, keep up an undisturbedly regular pace. The stamping of the horses held in with difficulty, the thundering of the bronze-covered wheels, the metallic clash of weapons, gave to this line something formidable and imposing enough to raise terror in the most intrepid bosoms. The helmets, plumes, and breastplates, dotted with red, green, and yellow, the gilded bows and brass swords, glittered and blazed terribly in the light of the sun, open in the sky, above the Libyan chain, like a great Osirian eye, and it was felt that the onslaught of such an army must sweep away the nations like a whirlwind, which drives a light straw before it. Beneath these innumerable wheels, the earth resounded and trembled, as if it had been moved by some convulsion of nature. To the chariots succeeded the battalions of infantry, marching in order, their shields on the left arm, in the right hand the lance, curved club, bow, sling, or axe, according as they were armed. The heads of these soldiers were covered with helmets, adorned with 2 horsehair tails, their bodies girded with a cuirass belt of crocodile skin. Their impassible look, the perfect regularity of their movements, their reddish copper complexions, deepened by a recent expedition to the burning regions of Upper Ethiopia, their clothing powdered with the desert sand, they awoke admiration by their discipline and courage. With soldiers like these, Egypt could conquer the world. After them came the allied troops, recognizable from the outlandish form of their headpieces, which looked like truncated mitres, or were surmounted by crescents spitted on sharp points. Their wide-bladed swords and jagged axes must have produced wounds which could not be healed. Slaves carried on their shoulders or on barrows the spoils enumerated by the herald, and wild beast tamers dragged behind them leashed panthers, cheetahs, crouching down as if trying to hide themselves. ostriches fluttering their wings, giraffes which overtop the crowd by the entire length of their necks, and even brown bears, taken, they said, in the mountains of the moon. The procession was still passing, long after the king had entered his palace. From The Marsh. It is a pond whose sleepy water lies stagnant, covered with a mantle of lily pads and rushes. Under the creeping duckweed, the wild ducks dip, their sapphire necks glazed with gold. At dawn, the teal is seen bathing, and when twilight reigns, it settles between two rushes and sleeps. From The Dragonfly. Upon the heather sprinkled with morning dew, upon the wild rose bush, upon the shady trees, upon the hedges growing along the path, upon the modest and dainty daisy that droops its dreamy brow, upon the rye, like a green billow unrolled by the winged caprice of the wind, the dragonfly gently rocks. The doves. On the hillside, yonder where are the graves, a fine palm tree like a green plume stands with head erect. In the evening the doves come to nestle under its cover. But in the morning they leave the branches. Like a spreading necklace, they may be seen scattering in the blue air, perfectly white, and settling farther upon some roof. My soul is the tree where every eve, as they, white swarms of mad visions fall from heaven, with fluttering wings, to fly away with the first rays. The Pot of Flowers. Sometimes a child finds a small seed, and at once, delighted with its bright colors, to plant it, he takes a porcelain jar adorned with blue dragons and strange flowers. He goes away. The root, snake-like, stretches, breaks through the earth, blooms, becomes a shrub. Each day, farther down, it sinks its fibrous foot, until it bursts the sides of the vessel. The child returns. Surprised, he sees the rich plant over the vase's debris, brandishing its green spikes. He wants to pull it out, but the stem is stubborn. The child persists and tears his fingers with the pointed arrows. Thus grew love in my simple heart. I believed I sowed but a spring flower. 'Tis a large aloe, whose root breaks the porcelain vase with the brilliant figures. Prayer. As a guardian angel, take me under your wing. Day to stoop and put out, smiling, your maternal hand to my little hand, to support my steps and keep me from falling. But Jesus, the sweet Master, with celestial love, suffered little children to come to him. As an indulgent parent, he submitted to their caresses and played with them without showing weariness. O you who resemble those church pictures where one sees, on a gold background, august charity preserving from hunger, preserving from cold, a fair and smiling group sheltered in her folds. Like the nursling of the Divine Mother, for pity's sake, lift me to your lap. Protect me, poor young girl, alone and orphan, whose only hope is in God, whose only hope is in you. The Poet and the Crowd. One day the plain said to the idle mountain, nothing ever grows upon thy wind-beaten brow. To the poet, bending thoughtful over his lyre, the crowd also said, dreamer, of what use art thou? Full of wrath, the mountain answered the plain, it is I who make the harvest grow upon thy soil. I temper the breath of the noon sun. I stop in the skies the clouds as they fly by. With my fingers I knead the snow into avalanches. In my crucible I dissolve the crystals of glaciers, and I pour out, from the tip of my white breasts, in long silver threads, the nourishing streams. The poet in his turn answered the crowd, allow my pale brow to rest upon my hand. Have I not from my side, from which runs out my soul, made a spring gush to slake men's thirst? The first smile of spring. While to their perverse work Men run panting, March that laughs in spite of showers, quietly get spring ready. For the little daisies, slyly when all sleep, he irons little collars and chisels gold studs. Through the orchard and the vineyard he goes, cunning hairdresser, with a swan puff and powders snow white the almond tree. Nature rests in her bed. He goes down to the garden and laces the rosebuds in their green velvet corsets. While composing solfeggios that he sings in a low tone to the blackbirds, he strews the meadow with snowdrops and the woods with violets. By the side of the cress in the brook, where drinks the stag, with listening ear, with his concealed hand he scatters the silver bells of the lilies of the valley. Then, when his work is done, and his reign about to end, on the threshold of April, turning his head, he says, "Spring, you may come." The veterans from the Old Guard. The thing is worth considering. 3 ghosts of old veterans in the uniform of the Old Guard with 2 shadows of hussars. Since the supreme battle, one has grown thin, the other stout. The coat once made to fit them is either too loose or too tight. Don't laugh, comrade, but rather bow low to these Achilles of an Iliad that Homer would not have invented. Their faces with the swarthy skins speak of Egypt with the burning sun, and the snows of Russia still powder their white hair. If their joints are stiff, it is because on the battlefield flags were their only blankets, and if their sleeves don't fit, it is because a cannonball took off their arm. End of section 36.
Section 37 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 15, by Various. Selected poems by John Gay, 1685 to 1732. In the great society of the wits, said Thackeray, John Gay deserves to be a favourite and to have a good place. The wits loved him. Prior was his faithful ally. Pope wrote him frequent letters of affectionate good advice. Swift grew genial in his merry company, and when the jester lapsed into gloom as jesters will, all his friends hurried to coddle and comfort him. His verse was not of the first order, but the list of English classics contains far poorer. It is entertaining enough to be a pleasure even to bright children of this generation, and each succeeding one reads it with an inherited fondness, not by any means without help from its own merits. And the man who invented comic opera, one of the most enduring moulds in which English humour has been cast, deserves the credit of all important literary pioneers. Kind, lazy, clever John Gay came of a good impoverished Devonshire family, which seems to have done its best for the bright lad of 12 when it apprenticed him to a London silk mercer. The boy hated this employment, grew ill under its fret and confinement, went back to the country, studied, possibly wrote poor verses, and presently drifted back to London. The cleverest men of the time frequented the crowded taverns and coffee-houses, and the talk that he heard at Will's and Button's may have determined his profession. Thither came Pope and Addison, Swift and Steele, Congreve, St. John, Prior, Arbuthnot, Cibber, Hogarth, Walpole, and many a powerful patron who loved good company. Perhaps through some kind acquaintance made in this informal circle, Gay obtained a private secretaryship and began the flirtation with the Muse, which became serious only after some years of coldness on that humorous lady's part. His first poem, Wine, published when he was 23, is not included in his collected works, perhaps because it's written in blank verse, perhaps because his maturer taste condemned it. 3 years later, in 1711, when the success of The Spectator was yet new, and Pope had just completed his brilliant Art of Criticism, and Swift was editing the Examiner and working on that defence of a French piece, The Conduct of the Allies, which was to make him the talk of London, Gay sent forth his second venture, a curious, unimportant pamphlet, The Present State of Wit. Late in 1713 he is contributing to Dicky Steele's Guardian and sending elegies to his poetical miscellanies, and a little later, having become a favourite with the powerful Mr. Pope, he is made to bring up new reinforcements to the battle of that irascible gentleman with his ancient enemy Ambrose Philips. This he does in The Shepherd's Week, a sham pastoral which is full of wit and easy versification and shows very considerable talents as a parodist. This skit the luckless satirist dedicated to Bolingbroke, whose brilliant star was just passing into eclipse. Swift thought this harmless courtesy the real cause of the indifference of the Brunswick princes to the merits of the poet, and in an age when every spark of literary genius was so carefully nursed and utilized to sustain the weak dynasty, most likely he was right. For this reason or another, indifferent they were, and in a time when court favour counted enormously, poor indolent luxury-loving Gay had to earn his loaf by hard work, or go without it. He produced a tragicomic pastoral farce called What d'ye call it, which was the lineal ancestor of Pinafore and the Pirates of Penzance, in its method of treating farcical incidents in a grave manner. But the town did not see the fun of this expedient, and the play failed, though it contained, among other famous songs, "'Twas when the seas were roaring." In 1716, Trivia, or the Art of Walking the Streets of London, put some money into the poet's empty pocket, thanks to Pope's good offices. A year later, a second comedy of his, 3 Hours After Marriage, met with well-deserved failure. And now, as always, when his spirits sank, his good friends showered kindnesses upon him. Mr. Secretary Pulteney carried him off to Aix. Lord Bathurst and Lord Burlington were his to command. Many fine gentlemen, and particularly many fine ladies, pressed him to make indefinite country visits. In 1720 his friends managed the publication of his poems in 2 quarto volumes, subscribing for 10, 20, and even 50 copies apiece, some of them, and securing to the poet, it is said, £1,000. The younger Craggs, the bookseller, gave him some South Sea stock which rose rapidly, and at one time the improvident little gentleman found himself in possession of £20,000. All his friends besought him to sell, but Alnaschar Gay had visions of a splendid ease and opulence. The bubble burst, and poor Alnaschar had not wherewithal to pay his broker. The Duchess of Queensborough, Prior's Kitty, beautiful and young, had already annexed the charmer and now carried him off to Petersham. "I wish you had a little villikin in Mr. Pope's neighbourhood," scolds Swift to him, "but you are yet too volatile, and any lady with a coach and 6 horses might carry you to Japan." And again, "I know your arts of patching up a journey between stage-coaches and friends' coaches, for you are as arrant a cockney as any hosier in Cheapside. I have often had it in my head to put it into yours that you ought to have some great working scheme which may take up 7 years to finish, besides 2 or 3 under ones that may add another £1,000 to your stock, and then I shall be less in pain about you. I know you can find dinners, but you love 12-penny coaches too well, without considering that the interest of a whole £1,000 brings you but half a crown a day." Gay went to Bath with the Queensberrys and to Oxford. Swift complained to Pope, "I suppose Mr. Gay will return from Bath with £20 more flesh and £200 less money. Providence never designed him to be above 22 by his thoughtlessness and gullibility. He has as little foresight of age, sickness, poverty, or loss of admirers as a girl of 15, and his dear Mrs. Howard, afterwards Lady Suffolk, took him affectionately to task. Your head is your best friend. It would clothe, lodge, and feed you, but you neglect it, and follow that false friend, your heart, which is such a foolish tender thing that it makes others despise your head, that have not half so good a one on their own shoulders. In short, John, you may be a snail or a silkworm, but by my consent you shall never be a hare again." He lived under other great roofs, if not contentedly, at least gracefully and agreeably, If his dependent state irked him, his hosts did not perceive it. To Swift he wrote, indeed, "They wonder at each other for not providing for me, and I wonder at them all." Yet for the 9 years from 1722 to 1731 he had a small official salary on which a thriftier or more industrious mortal would have managed to live respectably even in that expensive age, and for at least a part of the time he had official lodgings at Whitehall. In 1725 was published the first edition of his famous fables, which had been written for the moral behoof of Prince William, afterward Duke of Cumberland, of unblessed memory. The book did not make his fortune with the court, as he had hoped, and in 1728 he produced his best-known work, The Beggar's Opera. Nobody had much faith in this Newgate pastoral, least of all Swift, who had first suggested it, but it took the town by storm, running for 63 consecutive nights, as the heroine, Polly Peachum, the lovely Lavinia Fenton, captured a duchess's coronet. The songs were heard alike in the West End drawing-rooms and East End slums. Swift praised it for its morality, and the Archbishop of Canterbury scorned it for its condonation of vice. The breath of praise and blame filled equally its prosperous sails, blew it all over the kingdom, wherever a theatre could be found, and finally wafted it to Minorca. So well did the opera pay him that Gay wrote a sequel called Polly, which, being prohibited through some notion of Walpole's, sold enormously by subscription and earned Gay £1,200. After this, the hospitable Queensberrys seem to have adopted him. He produced a musical drama, Achis and Galatea, written long before and set to Handel's music, a few more fables, a thin opera called Achilles, and then his work was done. He died in London of a swift fever in December 1732, before his kind Kitty and her husband could reach him, or his other great friend, the Countess of Suffolk. Arbuthnot watched over him. Pope was with him to the last. Swift endorsed on the letter that brought him the tidings, "On my dear friend Mr. Gay's death, received on December 15th, but not read till the 20th by an impulse foreboding some misfortune." So faithfully did the giants, as Thackeray calls them, cherish this gentle, friendly, affectionate, humorous comrade. He seems indeed to have been almost the only companion with whom Swift did not at some time fall out, and of his steadfastness the gloomy great man in his Verses on My Own Death could write, "Poor Pope will grieve a month, and Gay a week, and Arbuthnot a day." The Trivia and the Shepherd's Week, the Achis and Galatea, and even the Beggar's Opera, gradually faded into the realm of old forgotten, far-off things, while the fables passed through many editions, found their place in school reading books, were committed to memory by 3 generations of admiring pupils, and included in the most orthodox libraries. Yet criticism now reverts to the earlier standard, approves the songs and the minute observation, the nice phrasing and the humorous swing of the pastorals and operas, and finds the fables dull, commonplace, and monotonous. Pope said in his affectionate epitaph that the poet had been laid in Westminster Abbey, not for ambition, but, quote, "that the worthy and the good shall say, striking their pensive bosoms, Here lies Gay." End quote. If today the worthy and the good do not know even where he lies, not the less is he to be gratefully remembered whom the best and greatest of his own time so much admired, and of whom Pope and Johnson and Thackeray and Dobson have written with the warmth of friendship. The Hare and Many Friends, from the Fables. Friendship, like love, is but a name, unless to one you stint the flame. The child whom many fathers share hath seldom known a father's care. 'Tis thus in friendships who depend on many rarely find a friend. A hare, who in a civil way complied with everything, like Gay, was known by all the bestial train who haunt the wood or graze the plain. Her care was never to offend, and every creature was her friend. As forth she went at early dawn to taste the dew-besprinkled lawn, behind she hears the hunter's cries, and from the deep-mouthed thunder flies. She starts, she stops, she pants for breath, she hears the near advance of death. She doubles to mislead the hound, and measures back her mazy round, till fainting in the public way, half dead with fear, she gasping lay. What transport in her bosom grew when first the horse appeared in view! "Let me," says she, "your back ascend, and owe my safety to a friend. You know my feet betray my flight, to friendship every burden's light." The horse replied, "Poor honest puss, it grieves my heart to see thee thus. Be comforted, relief is near, for all your friends are in the rear." She next the stately bull implored, and thus replied the mighty lord: "Since every beast alive can tell that I sincerely wish you well, I may without offence pretend to take the freedom of a friend. Love calls me hence, a favourite cow expects me near yon barley mow, and when a lady's in the case, you know all other things give place. To leave you thus might seem unkind, but see, the goat is just behind." The goat remarked her pulse was high, her languid head, her heavy eye. "My back," says he, "may do you harm. The sheep's at hand, and wool is warm." The sheep was feeble, and complained his sides a load of wool sustained, said he was slow, confessed his fears, for hounds eat sheep as well as hares. She now the trotting calf addressed, to save from death a friend distressed. "Shall I," says he, "of tender age in this important care engage? Older and abler passed you by. How strong are those, how weak am I! Should I presume to bear you hence, those friends of mine may take offence. Excuse me then, you know my heart, but dearest friends, alas, must part. How shall we all lament? Adieu, for see, the hounds are just in view." End of poem. The Sick Man and the Angel, from the Fables. "Is there no hope?" the sick man said. The silent doctor shook his head, and took his leave with signs of sorrow, despairing of his fee tomorrow. When thus the man with gasping breath, I feel the chilling wound of death. Since I must bid the world adieu, let me my former life review. I grant my bargains well were made, but all men overreach in trade. 'Tis self-defence in each profession. Sure, self-defence is no transgression. The little portion in my hands, by good security on lands, is well increased. If unawares, my justice to myself and heirs hath let my debtor rot in jail for want of good sufficient bail. If I, by writ or bond or deed, reduced a family to need, my will hath made the world amends. My hope on charity depends. When I'm numbered with the dead, and all my pious gifts are read, by heaven and earth 'twill then be known my charities were amply shown. An angel came. "Ah, friend," he cried, "no more in flattering hope confide. Can thy good deeds in former times outweigh the balance of thy crimes? What widow or what orphan prays to crown thy life with length of days? A pious action's in thy power. Embrace with joy the happy hour. Now, while you draw the vital air, prove your intention is sincere. This instant give £100, your neighbours want and you abound." "But why such haste?" the sick man whines. "Who knows as yet what heaven designs? Perhaps I may recover still. That sum and more are in my will." "Fool," says the vision, "now 'tis plain, your life, your soul, your heaven was gain. From every side with all your might you scraped and scraped beyond your right, and after death would fain atone by giving what is not your own. Where there is life there's hope," he cried. "Then why such haste?" So groaned and died. End of poem. The Juggler, from the Fables. A juggler long through all the town had raised his fortune and renown. You'd think, so far his art transcends, the devil at his fingers' ends. Vice heard his fame, she read his bill, convinced of his inferior skill, she sought his booth, and from the crowd defied the man of art aloud. "Is this, then, he so famed for sleight? Can this slow bungler cheat your sight? Dares he with me dispute the prize? I leave it to impartial eyes." Provoked, the juggler cried, "'Tis done, in science I submit to none." Thus said, the cups and balls he played, by turns this here that there conveyed. The cards, obedient to his words, are by a fillip turned to birds. His little boxes change the grain. Trick after trick deludes the train. He shakes his bag, he shows all fair, his fingers spread, and nothing there. Then bids it rain with showers of gold, and now his ivory eggs are told. But when from thence the hen he draws, amazed spectators hum applause. Vice now stepped forth and took the place with all the forms of his grimace. This magic looking-glass, she cries, there, handed round, will charm your eyes. Each eager eye the sight desired, and every man himself admired. Next to a senator addressing, see this banknote, observe the blessing. Breathe on the bill, high, pass, 'tis gone. Upon his lips a padlock shone. A second puff the magic broke, the padlock vanished, and he spoke. 12 bottles ranged upon the board, all full with heavy liquor stored, by clean conveyance, disappear, and now 2 bloody swords are there. A purse she to a thief exposed, at once his ready fingers closed. He opes his fist, the treasure's fled, he sees a halter in its stead. She bids ambition hold a wand, he grasps a hatchet in his hand. A box of charity she shows. Blow here, and a churchwarden blows. 'Tis vanished with conveyance neat, and on the table smokes a treat. She shakes the dice, the board she knocks, and from her pockets fills her box. A counter in a miser's hand grew 20 guineas at command. She bids his heir the sum retain, and 'tis a counter now again. A guinea with her touch you see take every shape but charity, and not one thing you saw or drew but changed from what was first in view. The juggler, now in grief of heart with this submission, owned her art. Can I such matchless sleight withstand? How practice hath improved your hand! But now and then I cheat the throng, you every day, and all day long. End of poem. Sweet William's Farewell to Black-eyed Susan, a ballad. All in the downs the fleet was moored, the streamers waving in the wind, when black-eyed Susan came aboard. Oh, where shall I my true love find? Tell me, ye jovial sailors, tell me true, if my sweet William sails among the crew. William, who high upon the yard rocked with the billow to and fro, soon her well-known voice he heard, he sighed and cast his eyes below. The cord slides swiftly through his glowing hands, and quick as lightning on the deck he stands. So the sweet lark, high poised in air, shuts close his pinions to his breast, if chance his mate's shrill call he hear, and drops at once into her nest. The noblest captain in the British fleet might envy William's lip those kisses sweet. Oh, Susan, Susan, lovely dear, my vows shall ever true remain. Let me kiss off that falling tear, we only part to meet again. Change as ye list, ye winds, my heart shall be the faithful compass that still points to thee. Believe not what the landmen say, who tempt with doubts thy constant mind. They'll tell thee, sailors when away in every port a mistress find. Yes, yes, believe them when they tell thee so, for thou art present wheresoe'er I go. If to far India's coast we sail, thy eyes are seen in diamonds bright, thy breath is Afric's spicy gale, thy skin is ivory so white. Thus every beauteous object that I view wakes in my soul some charm of lovely Sue. Though battle call me from thy arms, let not my pretty Susan mourn. Though cannons roar, yet safe from harms, William shall to his dear return. Love turns aside the balls that round me fly, lest precious tears should drop from Susan's eye. The boatswain gave the dreadful word, the sails their swelling bosom spread, no longer must she stay aboard. They kissed, she sighed, he hung his head, her lessening boat unwilling rose to land. Adieu, she cries, and waved her lily hand. End of poem. From What You Call It, a ballad. 'Twas when the seas were roaring with hollow blasts of wind, a damsel lay deploring, all on a rock reclined. Wide o'er the foaming billows she cast a wistful look, her head was crowned with willows that tremble o'er the brook. 12 months are gone and over, and 9 long tedious days. Why didst thou, venturous lover, why didst thou trust the seas? Cease, cease, thou cruel ocean, and let my lover rest. Ah, what's thy troubled motion to that within my breast? The merchant, robbed of pleasure, sees tempests in despair. But what's the loss of treasure to losing of my dear? Should you some coast be laid on where gold and diamonds grow, you'll find a richer maiden, but none that loves you so. How can they say that nature has nothing made in vain? Why then beneath the water should hideous rocks remain? No eyes the rocks discover that lurk beneath the deep, to wreck the wandering lover and leave the maid to weep. All melancholy lying, thus wailed she for her dear, repaid each blast with sighing, each billow with a tear, when o'er the white waves stooping, his floating corpse she spied. Then like a lily drooping, she bowed her head and died. End of section 37. Read by Sandra, Montreal, 2022. Section 38 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 15, by Various. Selected poems by Emanuel von Geibel, 1815 to 1884. The chief note in Geibel's nature was reverence, a spirit of reverent piety, using the phrase in its widest as well as in its strictly religious sense, characterizes all his poetical utterances. He intended to devote himself to theology, but the humanistic tendencies of the age, combined with his own peculiar endowments, led him to abandon the church for pure literature. The reverent attitude of mind, however, remained and has left its impress even upon his most impassioned love lyrics. It appears, too, in his first literary venture, a volume of classical studies undertaken in collaboration with his friend Ernst Curtius, in which is displayed his loving reverence for the great monuments of Greek antiquity. He felt himself an exile from Greece, and like Goethe's Iphigenia, his soul was seeking ever for the land of Hellas, and through the influence of Bettina von Arnim, his longing was satisfied. He secured the post of tutor in the house of the Russian ambassador to Athens. Geibel was only 23 years of age when this good fortune fell to his lot. He was born at Lübeck on October 18, 1815. His poetic gifts, early manifested, secured him a welcome in the literary circles of Berlin. During the 2 years that he spent in Greece, he was enabled to travel over a large part of the Grecian archipelago in the inspiring company of Curtius, and it was upon their return to Germany in 1840 that the classical studies appeared, and were dedicated to the Queen of Greece. Then Geibel eagerly took up the study of French and Spanish, with the result that many valuable volumes were published in collaboration with Paul Heyse, Count von Schack, and Leuthold, which introduced to the German public a vast treasury of song from the literatures of France, Spain, and Portugal. The first collection of Geibel's own poems in 1843 secured for the poet a modest pension from the King of Prussia. Geibel also made several essays at dramatic composition. He wrote for Mendelssohn the text of Lorelei, but the composer died before the music was completed. A comedy called Master Andrew was successful in a number of cities, and of his more ambitious tragedies, Brunhild and Sophonisba, the latter won the famous Schiller Prize in 1869. In 1852, Geibel received an appointment as royal reader to Maximilian II, and was made professor at the University of Munich. It was also from the King of Bavaria that he procured his patent of nobility. In the same year that he took up his residence in Munich, he married, but the death of his wife terminated his happy family relations 3 years later, and the death of the king severed his connection with the Bavarian court. Moreover, his sympathy with the revolutionary poets, such as his intimate friend Freiligrath, his own enthusiasm for the popular movement, and the faith which he placed in the King of Prussia, led to bitter attacks upon him in the Bavarian press, and eventually to his resignation from the faculty of the university. He returned to his native city of Lübeck, The Prussian king trebled his annual income, and the poet was raised above pecuniary cares. The last years of his life were saddened without being embittered by feeble health. He died on April 6, 1884. There was sometimes a touch of effeminate sentimentality in Geibel's work, but he did not lack force and virility as his famous 12 sonnets and his political poems entitled Zeitgedichte show. He could speak strong words for right and justice, and in all his poems there is a musical beauty of language and a perfection of form that render his songs contributions of permanent value to the lyric treasury of German literature. Seest thou the sea? Seest thou the sea? The sun gleams on its wave with splendor bright, but where the pearl lies buried in its cave is deepest night. The sea am I, my soul in billows bold rolls fierce and strong, and over all, like to the sunlight's gold, there streams my song. It throbs with love and pain as though possessed of magic art, and yet in silence bleeds within my breast my gloomy heart. Translation of Francis Hellman. As it will happen. He loves thee not, he trifles but with thee, they said to her, and then she bowed her head, and pearly tears like roses dew wept she. Oh, that she ever trusted what they said, for when he came and found his bride in doubt, then, from sheer spite, he would not show his sorrow. He played and laughed and drank, day in, day out, to weep from night until the morrow. 'Tis true, an angel whispered in her heart, he's faithful still, oh, lay thy hand in his. And he too felt, midst grief and bitter smart, she loves thee, after all, thy love she is. Let but a gentle word pass on each side, the spell that parts you now will then be broken. They came, each looked on each, oh, evil pride, that single word remained unspoken. They parted then, as in a church one oft extinguished sees the altar lamps' red fires. Their light grows dim, then once more flares aloft in radiance bright, and thereupon expires. So died their love, at first lamented o'er, then yearned for ardently, and then forgotten, until the thought that they had loved before of mere delusion seemed begotten. But sometimes, when the moon shone out at night, each started from his couch. Ah, was it not bedewed with tears? And tears too dimmed their sight, because these two had dreamed, I know not what, and then the dear old times woke in their heart, their foolish doubts, their parting that had driven their souls so far, so very far apart. O God, let both now be forgiven. Translation of Francis Hellman. Gondoliera. O come to me when through the night the starry legions ride, then o'er the sea in the moonshine bright our gondola will glide. The air is soft as a lover's jest, and gently gleams the light. The zither sounds, and thy soul is blessed to join in this delight. O come to me when through the night the starry legions ride, then o'er the sea in the moonshine bright our gondola will glide. This is the hour for lovers true, darling, like thee and me. Serenely smile the heavens blue, and calmly sleeps the sea. And as it sleeps, a glance will say what speech in vain has tried. The lips then do not shrink away, nor is a kiss denied. O come to me when through the night the starry legions ride, then o'er the sea in the moonshine bright our gondola will glide. Translation of Francis Hellman. The woodland. The wood grows denser at each stride, no path more, no trail, only murmuring waters glide through tangled ferns and woodland flowers pale. Ah, and under the great oaks teeming, how soft the moss, the grass how high, and the heavenly depth of cloudless sky, how blue through the leaves it seems to me. Here I'll sit, resting and dreaming, dreaming of thee. Translation of Charles Harvey Genunk. Onward. Cease thy dreaming, cease thy quailing, wander on untiringly, though thy strength may all seem failing, onward must thy watchword be. Durst not tarry, though life's roses round about thy footsteps throng, though the ocean's depth discloses sirens with their witching song. Onward, onward, ever calling on thy muse in life's stern fray, till thy fevered brow feels, falling from above, a golden ray, till the verdant wreath victorious crown with soothing shade thy brow, till the spirit's flames rise, glorious over thee, with sacred glow. Onward then, through hostile fire, onward, through death's agony, who to heaven would aspire must a valiant warrior be. Translation of Francis Hellman. At last the daylight fadeth. At last the daylight fadeth, with all its noise and glare. Refreshing peace pervadeth the darkness everywhere. On the fields deep silence hovers. The woods now wake alone. What daylight ne'er discovers, their songs to the night make known. And what when the sun is shining, I ne'er can tell to thee. To whisper it now I am pining. O come and hearken to me. Translation of Francis Hellman. End of section 38. Read by Sandra, near Montreal, 2022. And end of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 15, by Various.